Due to copyright, I can't publish many audiobooks on YouTube. At our audiobook novel service, we offer access to over 300 full novels from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, Wuxia, and more, all in high-quality audio format. Each novel is available with a one-time payment only. No subscriptions, no monthly payment, and no ads. Payments via PayPal or Ko-fi. To browse the full list of available novels, message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out our full catalog on Discord. Chapter 7160. The Return of the Prize Wheel. VS pulled out the Radiant lottery ticket from his system space. The ticket was quite precious and troublesome to acquire. He could only obtain it by fabricating a new masterwork mech of his own design. There were other criteria. It had to be a serious project. His contribution had to be decisive enough. He couldn't just outsource most of the grunt work to the other members of the design department only to swoop in at the last second and finish the project in person. To claim that it was mainly his work was a form of professional dishonesty that he could not abide by. He was not that shameless enough. This was why he hadn't bothered to fabricate the first production models of the Bright Warrior Mark IV and so on. Their upgrades to the current mech generation were a bit too straightforward because that was all the subordinate mech designers could do. Without VS spending enough time to reinvent the mechs in question, there was only so much they could innovate while still retaining the original character of the relevant product lines. VS also realized that the more high-ranking masterwork mechs became available, the less opportunities existed to earn Radiant lottery tickets. After all, mechs such as the Everchanger and the Phobos had already become masterworks. There was no way he could upgrade them to the next tier of craftsmanship anytime soon. The best way to still earn Radiant lottery tickets was to design new custom mechs for the next generation of expert pilots that were rising up from the expeditionary fleet. VS and his wife could also dedicate their valuable design time on servicing the needs of external high-ranking mech pilots such as the Glory Seekers. However, the more they spent time on satisfying external clients, the less time they had left to meet the demands of their fellow Larkinsons. It all came down to time. VS and Gloriana had to juggle between many different needs. They could not simply drop everything and focus on maximizing the amount of Radiant lottery tickets they could earn per year. Wait, VS wondered how the system would react if both VS and Gloriana contributed equally to a mech design project that ultimately yielded a new masterwork mech. Would both of them be entitled to earn their own Radiant lottery tickets, or would the system award it to the highest contributor? It was an interesting question, and one that might very well get tested soon when they finally embarked on upgrading the Riot to her much more powerful incarnation soon. Before all of that could happen, VS first had to complete the present affair. "Are you all right, VS?" his wife softly asked as she approached his side. "You have been staring at that lottery ticket for an entire minute. Are you second-guessing your decision?" VS slowly shook his head. "No, I don't have any doubts. It is just, this is my last Radiant lottery ticket. This is my last shot at obtaining a miracle from the system. Until I earn another ticket, I can only rely on building up a reserve of ascension points. Let me guess. You have a persistent habit of draining your AP on anything that looks shiny." He chuckled. "More or less. That is a discipline problem. You need to set limits on yourself. Now go make use of the wishing fountain. Nothing will change if you keep standing here like an indecisive child." She was right. VS knew that there was not much chance that he would change his mind on the matter. Despite all of the gains from the recent Enlightenment fruit and the prizes from the golden lottery tickets, none of them granted him the degree of certainty that was necessary for him to build up enough confidence to win the leadership challenge. There may be a possibility that he was overestimating the combat strength of all of those ascended giants, but he did not think that was the case. Perhaps they may be new to fighting on the scale of a phase lord, and perhaps they did not have enough time to master their newfound spatial abilities, but their excellent martial prowess could not be denied. VS strongly believed that up to a certain extent skill trumped brute force. St. Dice had proven this time and time again as she fought against one powerful monster or another. Out of all of the high-ranking mech pilots of the Larkinson clan, she embodied this principle the most. Her extraordinary swordsmanship allowed her to outfight opponents that possessed much larger bodies or had more hard power at their disposal. The Ascended Giants might not be able to match the ace pilot's exaggerated skill in swordsmanship, but they should all be highly skilled at wielding their chosen weapons. VS could not allow himself to be the monster to a fighter that was at least as competent as a sword maiden in terms of fighting skills. Only by closing the gap would he be able to win not just one but multiple duels on a consecutive basis. If he did not remedy this obvious fault, then he may as well put on a show and do his best to lose gracefully 4 times in a row. "I need this," he told himself. "I could have gotten away with remaining an amateur so long as I stick with being a mech designer, but now that there is an opportunity to effectively gain control over the Phase Lord department, I cannot miss this opportunity. I need to give this a shot, and to do that I need to become more similar to the Ascended Giants that I hope to command in the future." Even if the Dark Apostle would be doing most of it, VS did not really mind too much, as the alter ego was essentially another part of himself. So long as they shared the same true body, their interests would remain aligned to a degree. Of course, that did not stop them from scheming on how to kick the other one out if they could. Both of them considered their body to belong solely to one of them. How could they possibly remain happy if they were forced to share to the point where they had to formulate a weekly schedule? It was absurd. VS intended to look into this problem at a later date. For now, he had no choice but to give the Dark Apostle a better shot at defeating the leaders of the Ascended Giants and impress his future subordinates with his superior combat prowess. Please give me an enlightenment fruit that teaches me how to wield a spear. He beseeched the wishing fountain. It would be best if the fighting method also draws upon the power of the life metal or darkness attributes. He was not sure how extensively the wishing fountain narrowed down the selection, but it did not hurt to be precise. VS finally tossed the ticket into the fountain water. Just like in previous cases, the water began to light up in rainbow colors. A sense of grandeur and momentum began to radiate from the wishing fountain. Both Kedis and Gloriana looked impressed at the light show. They grew more and more interested in what the wishing fountain would produce. Soon enough, a very familiar wheel appeared in front of the three mech designers. Is that a prize wheel? Yup. That is what happens when you use up the higher grades of lottery tickets. It is not completely random. You can narrow down the category of prizes, and you can also exert at least a bit of control over what you want to obtain. That doesn't mean it is easy to get what you want, but at least the wishing fountain is generous enough to give us agency over the prize draw. VS generally liked the prize wheel because it was simple and easier to predict than the other forms of prize draws. He especially disliked the time where he had to navigate in a little boat across choppy and windswept waters. Gloriana looked dubiously at the prize wheel. How can you control what kind of prize you can draw? This wheel looks as if it has considerable heft. You will need to calculate how much force you need to exert for it to spin just enough for it to land at the desired prize. It is impossible to make a correct estimation if we do not know the mass of this wheel and how much friction is generated. You're right, he said. That is why I just do it by feel. This is not a problem that you need to solve by math. Trust me. From the moment you spin the wheel, you can already get an impression of how heavy it is. You will have to guess how much more force you need to exert to make it spin far enough. What if your guess is wrong? Then I will still get something from the wishing fountain. It just won't be the prize that I had my eye upon. VS shrugged. He had used up enough lottery tickets to make peace with this reality. Lotteries were not supposed to be reliable dispensers of goods in the first place. They began to examine the wheel. Just like before, the outer edge of the wheel depicted many different symbols that alluded to the prizes they were associated with. It was up to VS and the others to interpret what they meant. Well, I believe the wishing fountain has answered your pleas because many of these symbols depict spears. Kedis mentioned. Not all of them, though. At least a quarter of them depict other weapons such as swords, knives, halberds, hammers, and even fists. VS frowned. We will have to avoid them then. That is easier said than done. These alternative weapon skills are not placed in their own quadrant, but they are instead dispersed across the wheel. Of course. Damn wishing fountain. He muttered. Aside from depicting the weapons, that the skills were likely related to the symbols also depicted other clues on what the fighting styles emphasized. For example, there was one hammer symbol that was accompanied by wavy symbols that alluded to tremors. This was likely a weapon skill that could produce area damage by shaking the surrounding environment or inflict oscillating damage upon impact, similar to signature ability of the oscillating fist. The fact that these symbols were open to interpretation made it difficult to know for certain. Who knows whether VS or Kedis read them correctly? Look here, VS. This might be what you are interested in. Gloriana pointed at a symbol of a spear that was surrounded by three dark and ominous ghost-like entities. VS frowned. He did not really have a good feeling about the possible prize associated with this symbol. Just because I have a preference for the darkness element doesn't mean I want to fight alongside an army of evil ghosts or something. I need to pay attention to my image. If I come across as a demon, people will eventually treat me like one. I will take this if there is nothing better for me, but I would prefer to aim for a different prize. He soon spotted a possible skill that appealed to him a little better. It was a spear that punched straight through a metal plate. This is probably a skill that focuses on increasing the penetration power of the spear tip and nothing else. Kedis judged. It is probably based on the metal element. It may be one-dimensional, but it is enough to dominate a fight. At best, you can turn any transphasic weapon into a superdimensional weapon in terms of piercing power. You can force all of those ascended giants to go on the defensive if you have mastered this capability. That sounded nice, but VS was not quite sure whether it worked that way. There is not enough information to tell us whether the enhanced penetration power is also effective against energy defenses. He said. The biggest impediment to defeating phase lords is not their armor or their gigantic true bodies, but their spatial barriers. That is what I need to overcome first. Chapter 71-61. The right spin. Radiant lottery tickets were fairly high-end, which meant that the prizes that VS could draw from them were always premium goods. The prize will clearly drew from a pool that contained a large variety of powerful enlightenment fruits. The symbols at the edge of the wheel made tantalizing promises. Their vagueness and lack of explanations stimulated the imaginations of the three mech designers. Look at this dagger vs. It gives off the impression that you can suck out someone's soul if you manage to stab them in the body. This collection of blurred spears is likely based around speed. You can unleash 10 attacks in the same time your opponent launches a single attack. Wow! Look at this spear skill. A phoenix is launched from the spear. I wonder whether the summoned phoenix is alive. This must be a great way to soften up an opponent from a distance. This looks like a skill designed to slay giants. I wonder how it works. There were over 100 different prizes in the pool. The lack of clarification made it difficult for VS to narrow down his selection and favor one prize over another. Nonetheless, he needed to carry on with the process. After examining every symbol one by one, VS made a shortlist on the symbols that held the most promise from his perspective. He let his wife and his former student take a look at his list so that they could offer him feedback. You have put the penetrating spear skill at the top of your list. Keddies noted. Yes. Is that wrong? Not necessarily, but the gains will likely be similar to the previous enlightenment fruit that you have absorbed. The new skill will only make you better at performing stabbing attacks with a spear. What about defense? What about the other moves? I know you have a foundation in wielding staves, but this is different. The swordmaster raised a decent point, but VS still believed that this was a decent choice. I do not mind it if all I get out of this fruit is a killer solution. The only reason why I am still keeping my options open is because I am not sure whether it is effective against energy defenses. If there is no special benefit in this aspect, then what I will get is not that useful in the initial stages of a fight. I will have to wear down the first layer of defense of an ascended giant the hard way. At least I should be able to produce more results by stabbing my spear more effectively. If you want to do that, you are better off with learning how to launch your attacks much faster than normal. Keddies advised and pointed at the third item on his shortlist. You pretty much know what you will get if you aim for this prize. There is not as much room for interpretation. The ability to launch attacks faster than your opponents will not necessarily let you win a duel, but it is an undeniable advantage. The only downside is whether your body can persist in this long enough and how much faster your stamina will drain in combat. Every fighting method had its strengths and weaknesses. One was not necessarily superior to the others. The most suitable fighting skill depended on whether it fit his own inclinations and whether it was effective against his upcoming opponents. I think you should think about going for your fourth choice, Gloriana mentioned as she studied his shortlist. I know that you don't specialize in the fire element, but the ability to shoot out a phoenix from your spear is a much safer way to fight against phase lords who excel at close quarters combat. This is a skill that synergizes well with Blinky, who can shape and command the fire element in the Dark Apostle's stead. Her suggestion sounded good. This was the key reason why he placed this skill under consideration despite not possessing a strong preference over mastering a fire-based skill. Most of the skills offered by the prize did not focus all that much on using the spear as a medium to launch spells. While that basically conformed to his initial demands, if the alternatives were good enough, then VS was more than willing to change his mind. A phoenix was one of the most impressive mythological symbols associated with the fire element. Any skill that claimed an association with a phoenix had to be powerful. His ability to wield this skill upon acquisition would most likely be limited by how extensively Blinky could call upon fire energy, and how well he was able to apply the newly mastered techniques. One big concern was whether this skill was powerful enough in a medium energy environment. A phase lord was a physically imposing adversary whose defenses were always formidable. Spraying such an adversary with flames might not work, especially if the power of those fire attacks turned out to be disappointing. Perhaps VS could enhance the power of this skill by incorporating flamethrowers in his weapon or his raiment. That may be a good way to amplify the potency of his skills. You need to make up your mind. Keddies reminded him. Many of these skills are located far apart on the prize wheel. If you target one skill, you will have to give up on acquiring the others. That is assuming that you manage to spin the wheel with the right force. She was right. VS had to make a lot of hard choices when he formulated his shortlist, but this was not enough for him to complete the prize draw. He closed his eyes. He had reached the limits of his decisiveness by drawing upon his logic. Now he chose to make his final choice by basing it on feel. Which one called to him more? Which skill would he or his alter ego enjoy mastering the most? Which skill promised to deliver the greatest satisfaction? VS kept all of this in mind and more as his heart meandered back and forth between the different choices. It ultimately settled on the second item on the shortlist. It did not surprise him too much that he ended up picking it. While it came with an ominous implication, he believed it was a perfect fit for the Dark Apostle. His wife and the Swordmaster expressed more ambivalence at his final selection. The skill, Gloriana trailed. It shows a spear being wielded by a man who wears a horned helmet. The wielder may have undergone a transformation, but the symbol does not make that entirely clear. It also does not explain whether this transformation is temporary or permanent. I think it is only a temporary effect. Even if it is permanent, there should be solutions available that can reverse the process. Why favor this one over the others? Because it isn't as flashy. VS responded. The other skills promise to make me launch my attacks faster or have them punch through armor. These are flashy abilities, but they are a bit one-dimensional. My upcoming opponents can use targeted strategies or other solutions to limit the effectiveness of my new capabilities. It will be harder for them to counter me if my new skill is a lot more comprehensive. Kedis understood his argument. I can understand your logic. This indeed appears to be a skill that does not only transform you into a stronger state, but also lets you wield your spear with greater skill. If that was not the case, the symbol would not have included the weapon. There had to be something special about this skill. VS did not have any hunches or anything that led him to believe that it was better than the others. He just believed that it offered a better fit than the other choices. VS finally moved forward. He stepped to the side of the large wheel and grabbed hold of it before pulling it down to spin the wheel. Damn! This wheel is lighter than I thought. He only intended to exert a light amount of force in order to build up initial momentum and get a better feel of how much more force he had to put into it, but the prize will largely ruined his plan by being so light that it could already complete an entire revolution with the initial pull. VS suppressed his panic and tried his best to adapt to the changing situation. He rapidly scanned the wheel and tried his best to figure out how to end up at the exact right angle to win his targeted prize. It was originally situated 3/4 of the way. If the wheel blew right past it in the first revolution, then VS had to exert a small amount of force to make sure that it almost completed 2 revolutions. VS knew that he also had to make sure to keep it to a light touch, as he could already feel that the wheel did not endure that much friction. Its deceleration rate was not as much as last time, which further complicated his attempt to obtain the right prize. After he felt he had given the wheel enough momentum to complete a 630-degree spin, he let go and stepped back. Just as expected, the wheel did not spit quickly, but it did not slow down as fast either. It was agonizing to see it complete a lazy spin while not giving VS a solid indicator whether it would slow down just enough to end up with the right prize, let alone enter the correct quadrant. I think this may be the Wishing Fountain's lesson to us, that it is not a shop. Gloriana commented. We are never in full control, no matter how much we try to manipulate the outcome. A lottery must always remain a game of chance. If the outcome is predetermined, then it should go by a different name. Kedis crossed her arms. I am not sure about that. I think that there is a surprising degree of symbolism to how this wishing fountain grants us agency when we use up the more valuable lottery tickets. It may be a lesson that teaches us that as we gain more strength, we gain more and more control over our environment. The stronger we become, the more we can shape our surroundings according to our will. This is the universal truth of power. VS was not so sure that there was so much depth behind the wishing fountain. His own personal explanation was that the system simply teased him and sought to subvert his expectations. The wheel had passed 1 revolution by now. It had also slowed down by a measure, but still retained plenty of momentum. VS grew increasingly more nervous. While it would not be a disaster if the prize will delivered a different result than expected, he may have to rethink his entire approach towards the leadership challenge if he obtained anything weird. As the wheel slowly reached the right quadrant, it slowed down by a much greater extent. It continued to spin in a lazy fashion, taking a little more time to shift from one prize to another. Multiple agonizing seconds passed as the wheel finally reached the right prize. The wheel kept moving at a very slow pace and almost threatened to select the next prize instead. It stopped. Yes. VS immediately felt relief. I'm so good. How? Gloriana looked gobsmacked. This is a highly improbable result. How could you end up with the right prize when you did not perform any precise calculations beforehand? Kedis smiled. Not everything has to be done by calculating your moves in advance. Confidence and intuition can help you bridge the gap. You should try it yourself if you end up in a similar position. VS could not entirely explain why he succeeded this time, but he didn't really care. He already gazed hungrily at the wishing fountain as a pillar finally rose up from the water and presented a dark but glowing enlightenment fruit. Chapter 71-62. Innate Demon. VS froze for a long time as his mind, body, and spirit underwent major transformations. It became clear that the dark but glowing enlightenment fruit was anything but normal. The amount of knowledge and fighting skill imparted by the enlightenment fruit was so great that he had lost all awareness of his surroundings. As he rapidly internalized the contents of the enlightenment fruit, he finally knew what he had gained from the wishing fountain. Demonic Possession Spearmanship imparts the theory, skills, affinity, and a starter vessel needed to practice demonic possession spearmanship, a forbidden art that combines spearmanship with demonology. Demonic Possession Spearmanship centers around the dangerous art of nurturing the innate demon inside yourself. This innate demon is the dark side of most existences and sustains itself through the power of malevolence. Not all organisms possess an innate demon, and it is possible to remove it in advance. The practitioner of this art must persistently feed the innate demon in order to increase its strength. The practitioner must also direct the growth of the innate demon, so that it can offer greater assistance when called upon with the help of specific methods. Care must be taken so that the growth of the innate demon does not surpass the practitioner's ability to maintain control. By mastering the right spear techniques, the wielder can call upon the power of the innate demon while maintaining separation between oneself and the dangerous being. More profound and difficult spear techniques can even manifest the innate demon in its entirety, enabling it to act independently or facilitate complete possession where the innate demon completely overlaps with the practitioner. At an advanced level of mastery, the practitioner can attempt to channel the power of other demons, such as those locked in artifacts or summoned from different locations. These power manifestations are more difficult to sustain, but can produce new manifestations that are not possible with the innate demon. This can enable the wielder. The combination between the skill of the wielder and the power of the innate demon can enable the spear practitioner to defeat most fighters and demons at the same level due to lacking the same advantages. The difficulty in practicing demonic possession spearmanship lies in placating the demon and preventing it from taking control. The practitioner must always stay on guard and not let the innate demon overpower him. The innate demon can be banished at the expense of invalidating much of the techniques of demonic possession spearmanship. Requirements: strength must be 5 or higher. Endurance must be 8 or higher. Concentration must be 10 or higher. Spirituality must be 20 or higher. The system was not kidding when it described demonic possession spearmanship as a fusion between demonology and spearmanship. VS needed to develop a considerable understanding and mastery in both fields before he could effectively practice this advanced fighting method. The consequences of losing control were great. This business about nurturing the innate demon did not come without risk. It was flirting with danger. Although it was a lot better than outright getting possessed by a demon, containment still remained a persistent issue. In order to make sure that VS knew what he was doing and gained everything he needed to properly nurture and manage his so-called innate demon, the enlightenment fruit dumped a huge amount of knowledge related to the forbidden field of demonology into his head. This was incredibly valuable by itself. It should constitute an entire enlightenment fruit on its own, but VS had no complaints that all of this dense theory was included in the current package. What mattered was that VS gained much greater insight into the true nature and workings of demons. He not only learned where they came from and why they existed, but also understood a lot better why they were so universally hostile and even how to best gain their obedience. VS learned many different clues and techniques on how to summon demons, how to create them, and how to strengthen them, how to weaken them, how to banish them, and how to kill them completely if possible. When he looked back on how he and Helena managed their demons, he wanted to palm his face. They were so ignorant that they had ignored very clear risks and dangers. Their methods were also painfully crude. From the effort it took to turn souls into demons to trying to upgrade them by putting them into the self-developed demon mixers, every part of this process was flawed from beginning to end. Now that VS gained a surprisingly comprehensive foundation in demonology, he already gained a lot of ideas on how to redesign or start over those aforementioned processes. Doing so would enable him to produce middle demons faster and a lower cost than before. The middle demons would also end up stronger and master more comprehensive abilities when they emerged. There were major differences between different demons, much like there were differences between different humans. Humans that grew up in a third-rate state were naturally less capable than humans who grew up in a first-rate state. What VS needed to do was to upgrade his own treatment and facilities for demons so that they conformed to a higher standard. The middle demons that he could produce under advanced conditions would definitely help him get more out of his new fighting method. And what a fighting method he obtained! Unlike the previous enlightenment fruits he ingested, VS gained a much more complete foundation on how to wield and fight like a spear. He felt much closer to becoming a serious warrior. Although he did not think he had attained the mindset and dedication of a swordmaster, a demonic possession spearman was still a legitimate fighting profession, though it was largely based on chi cultivation and contract cultivation as opposed to willpower cultivation. Chi cultivators were much weaker than willpower cultivators in direct confrontations, but one of the advantages of the former was that it was much easier for them to draw power from external sources. That was the entire premise of demon possession spearmanship. There was inherent acceptance in the weakness of oneself. Only by acknowledging the truth could a spearman embrace a fighting method where he leveraged the strength of potent demons in order to enhance his combat techniques. In order to achieve the best results, the practitioner could not afford to neglect his spearmanship. As weak and flawed as it may be, it was still important for the cultivator of this fighting method to master the basics and build up a solid foundation. It was not necessary for the spear wielder to excel in any single move or technique. In fact, it was better for the practitioner to possess a rounded fighting style because that meant that he was able to channel the strength of any innate demon. The enlightenment fruit imparted him with a solid foundation just as he desired. His skill in wielding a spear surpassed that of a staff. He understood the nuances of different moves much better. He particularly gained a lot of confidence in exchanging blows with humanoid weapon wielders. Demonic possession spearmen were largely expected to fight and win battles against swordsman spearmen and other martial cultivators. That did not mean that demonic possession spearmen were weak when they attempted to fight against exobeasts or other monsters. The biggest difference was that brute force mattered a lot more than finesse. It was a good thing that the Enlightenment fruit imparted VS with a fairly basic but complete collection of templates that allowed him to leverage the power of his innate demon in useful ways. VS called them templates as opposed to extraordinary spear techniques because he needed to fill in the blanks himself. Every innate demon was unique, and the most optimal way to draw from their power was also different in every circumstance. The best the creator of this fighting method could do was to create the broad strokes of offensive techniques, defensive techniques, movement techniques, and other weird techniques. It was up to people like VS to adapt the templates to his own unique input and experiment until he was able to produce the output he desired. That was a very simple explanation of a very long and dangerous process of developing effective power moves for this forbidden branch of spearmanship. Every individual expression of demonic possession spearmanship was unique. It was impossible for two people to fight in the same way because they had to adapt to the variables presented by their own innate demons. An innate demon that possessed an insidious and scheming character was more likely to promote a form of spearmanship that relied on traps and sneak attacks. An innate demon that constantly raged and possessed the mindless desire to destroy everything was more likely to facilitate a form of spearmanship that strongly emphasized offense and launching continuous attacks. An innate demon that wanted to conquer everything and subjugate as many slaves as possible would probably develop a more exotic form of spearmanship that could demoralize those that got struck and mobilize the power of minions in a fight. In short, demonic possession spearmanship was open-ended enough to accommodate a wide variety of circumstances. VS definitely needed this because an unexpected mutation had occurred as he was rapidly assimilating the bounty from the potent Enlightenment fruit. When it came time to nurture his own innate demon, the starter vessel mentioned by the system got stuck and did not know where to go in order to do its job. What? It felt as if the starter vessel suffered an unexpected error as it encountered a situation that it had never accounted for in its programming. While VS did not know whether he possessed an innate demon, that he had yet to discover, the starter vessel could not decide whether to approach Blinky or the Dark Apostle. Neither of the two met the definition of an innate demon. With his new mastery of demonology, he understood quite well that so long as either of them still possessed positive traits, they remained positive life forms more or less. However, Blinky and the Dark Apostle just so happened to share enough traits with demons to be able to substitute for them if possible. VS was reminded of a similar instance where he was able to mutate his expression of the Dark Apostle self-defense manual by redirecting the worship of a dark and unfathomable existence to Blinky. Since Blinky's imaginary universe contained plenty of darkness energy and other negative energies, he could technically moonlight as a dark god. A similar situation applied in this case as well. Blinky possessed greater elemental compatibility, but the Dark Apostle was much closer to matching the definition of his dark side. Given that the starter vessel apparently mistook the two for potential innate demon candidates, that left VS to choose who to treat as the innate demon for his new fighting method. He smirked. That is an easy choice. He would always prefer to rely on a friendly source of support as opposed to a more adversarial one. Besides, VS questioned whether it made sense for the Dark Apostle to possess himself when he tried to channel any power moves. It was much simpler to draw on Blinky's power even if he did not technically meet the definition of an innate demon. Another reason why he settled on this choice was because Blinky was a much more powerful source of E-energy. That was important as demonic possession spearmanship was heavily reliant on negative E-energy to power all of its moves. In fact, VS wondered whether it was possible to channel positive energies through the same spear techniques. Although this was very much not intended by the original developers of this remarkable fusion fighting method, choosing a companion spirit as his innate demon theoretically made this possible. VS had essentially jailbroken an advanced fighting method before he had even begun to practice it in earnest. How exhilarating! Chapter 7163. VS The Spearman Mass Release Day, March 5th. Although the so-called starter vessel encountered problems when trying to merge with Blinky, the Starcat easily solved that problem when he proactively facilitated this process. It took a bit of problem solving, but the vessel finally integrated with the companion spirit, causing him to change in a subtle way. The best way that VS could describe the changes was that Blinky gained additional ports, in a manner of speaking. In fact, VS felt he had gained additional ways to draw upon the vast reserves of the Blinkyverse. In the past, one of the limitations that made Blinky less effective as a combat supplement was his small throughput. The portal that connected the Blinkyverse to the real universe was too small to channel too much E-energy at once. The so-called starter vessel that just merged with added a new interface that significantly eased this constraint by opening up new ways for him to channel E-energy to fuel a powerful demonic technique. Fascinating. As the changes to VS as well as Blinky began to settle, they both remained still as they came to terms with their new selves. Are you okay, VS? Gloriana asked with concern. I am, dear. Just give me a few more moments. The Enlightenment fruit was a big one, all right. The magnitude of changes is far greater than with the previous fruit. It is as if I have just swallowed a meal that was as big as my true body. There is no way I can digest it all right away. There is only so much the enlightenment fruit can grant me instant mastery over the entire package. It sounds as if you managed to get enough value out of the Radiant lottery ticket. How much would you estimate its worth? Fairly high. Maybe 500 AP, but not that much more. VS loosely guessed. It has a solid foundation, deep theoretical basis, and a fairly complete initial framework. The only problem is that it is a bit lacking in specific applications. It is up to individual practitioners of this demonic possession spearmanship to convert theory into practice based on the individual traits of their innate demons. Considering that Blinky has received the innate demon hat, I will have to make even more improvisations in order to make it all work. Innate demon? Let me send you another information package. I won't send everything since there are many parts of this knowledge that are dangerous in unskilled hands, but I will send you a description as well as the basic theory. Both Kedis and Gloriana fell silent as they perused the information package that they just received with their cranial implants. They grew increasingly more fascinated as they understood how this new fighting method worked. I have a better idea why this fruit is worth so much. If I understand this correctly, you became both a spearman and a demonologist, is that correct? Yes. VS nodded. Technically speaking, I can treat them as two separate disciplines. I can do stuff related to demonology that is completely separate from swinging a spear around. I can also fight like a competent spearman without channeling any demonic power. However, the issue with that is that I cannot rely on one or the other to win the upcoming duels. Only when I combine the two together can I exert much greater power in the field. The potential is great, but much of the challenge lies in figuring out how to leverage the power of my innate demon through my spear techniques. This requires a considerable amount of time investment on my part. Well, perhaps not me. I can shove most of this work onto the Dark Apostle. He will be the one that must rely on the new fighting method to defeat a bunch of ascended giants. Wait, VS. Kedis said. Earlier you mentioned that Blinky has somehow become the innate demon that this method is based upon. The Red Collective is working on a means for you to be able to shift your consciousness to Blinky when the Dark Apostle assumes control over your true body. Does that mean that you effectively become his demon under these circumstances? The thought had not yet crossed V's mind. That is a good question, Kedis. I truly don't know. We will have to experiment with this at least once. In my opinion, it may very well be true that I may be able to exert partial control over his power moves. I can make it weaker, stronger, or change its elemental alignment. I am looking forward to seeing how I can influence the ongoing fight. If VS was able to take more active control of how the Dark Apostle fought, then he would gain more power in his uneasy relationship with his other self. It was better to have more leverage than not. VS did not want to give too much freedom to the Dark Apostle because he definitely came across as a personality who would break a deal the moment it was no longer convenient. Let's leave the demon stuff behind for a moment, Kedis said as she scrutinized VS with an evaluating gaze. Do you think your spearmanship has improved enough to the point where you can rely solely on your new martial skill to keep up with those human phase lords? I don't know, VS said. Probably not, but I think the gap has definitely closed by a much larger margin. I don't just know how to throw a spear really good. I also know how to grip it in different ways, how to maintain my distance, what stance I should choose, how to lunge with it, how to parry and redirect the enemy's weapon, and etc. While my lacking combat experience will probably hold me back, that is a shortcoming that can be remedied over time. Then let's test that out right away. Now? Better do this sooner than later. It is not every day that you can spar against a swordmaster like myself. Kedis briefly grinned. Let's prepare our practice weapons first. VS picked up the rod that he used earlier while Kedis found a smaller rod that could serve as a general longsword. As soon as Kedis adopted a serious sword stance, her entire demeanor changed. Her willpower and intensity had become so much more pronounced that VS immediately felt intimidated. Much of the confidence he gained from his massive increase in martial strength suddenly deflated. Compared to a real swordmaster, an artificially produced demonic possession spearman like VS was probably a pushover. Fortunately, this impromptu sparring session was never about winning and losing. It was about familiarizing himself with his new fighting skills and testing it to see how it measured up against other opponents. Since Kedis did not do anything aside from trying to pressure VS on a mental level, he decided he had to take the initiative. He shuffled forward at a slow but steady pace. The tension in the air increased until VS suddenly threw out a lunge. Clang! Kedis easily batted aside the incoming rod with her own makeshift weapon, yet did not jump forward in order to press the attack. She instead shuffled back, giving VS an opportunity to recover and launch another attack. He did this repeatedly. He tried his best to catch Kedis off guard and attack from different angles, but she was too sharp and fast. This prompted VS to change his combat approach. He began to shift his grip and press forward in order to exert more leverage and force against the swordmaster. He introduced more movements. He put more of his weight behind his thrusts. He attempted to test her reaction speed by launching a flurry of spear attacks. He soon found out that Ketty's skill and combat awareness were amazing as expected. Yet VS was also not surprised to find out that his physical strength and condition were far superior to his sparring partner. This was pretty obvious as VS was a phase lord while Ketty's was still a human. For all of her transcendent skills and abilities, Ketty's frail human body held her back. It was not until she was able to break through to a sword saint that she would truly be able to exceed the limitations of her relatively weak physique, but even then the strengthening effect could not turn her into a human equivalent of a mech. There was only so much that her willpower could do to amplify the strength of her body. The base was too low. This was in sharp contrast to ace pilots whose ace mechs were much stronger. Perhaps the sparring session might favor Ketty's slightly more if she was allowed to equip herself with her superdimensional combat armor, but VS could strengthen his capabilities by relying on his own gear. Whatever the case, VS gained enough skill and understanding in spearmanship to know how he could leverage his superior strength and physicality to his advantage. Even if VS was not able to call upon the bulk of his physical might and mass when his true body was in a folded state, he was still able to summon a fraction of a percentage of his total strength. This proportionally minuscule boost still amounted to being able to apply thousands if not tens of thousands more newtons of force. VS grew bolder and launched swinging attacks that occasionally went as far as attempting to smack Ketty's from the side with the other end of his rod. Ketty's tried her best not to meet force with force, knowing that she suffered a disadvantage in this aspect. She instead moved to evade the attacks, which she could do with greater ease. The Swordmaster became a lot more difficult to hit. VS grew frustrated as his skills and reaction speed were not enough to improve his performance. While he was able to move faster than Ketty's, he needed time to go into motion and rely on his superior leg muscles to build up speed more quickly. If it came to making short shifts in different directions, VS did not feel that there was a significant speed advantage between himself and his adversary. Ketty's was just as fast as him when it came to the initial movements. The Swordmaster cleverly figured this out and circled around VS in order to deny him the chance to ever build up speed. He was even forced on the defensive as Ketty's amped up the aggression and constantly tried to smack her rod against V's body. While VS was able to keep up and block every incoming attack, his few attempts at parrying had failed when Ketty's rapidly darted away. The sparring session turned into such a challenging experience to VS that he felt he was reaching a limit to his patience. Enough! VS spontaneously called upon Blinky, who readily supplied him with a burst of darkness energy. He proceeded to take this darkness energy and channel it through his limbs and his rod in a specific way. Although the improvised weapon was a terrible carrier of darkness energy, its small size along with VS and Blinky's formidable control managed to make it work, if only barely. The end of the rod suddenly turned dark and thrummed with power. As VS thrust this empowered weapon forward with a surprising burst of speed, Ketty's widened her eyes and hastily blocked the incoming strike. She even channeled the power of Sharpie, causing her own rod to resonate very minutely. Clang! A small dark explosion set off on collision, causing both combatants to uncontrollably take a few steps back. I'm sorry, Ketty's. I instinctively called upon my new powers when this should have been a test of my pure fighting skills. It is okay, VS. I can handle surprises like these. The Swordmaster reassured him while making it clear that she remained unharmed. She stared at her own rod. Whatever you did just then is certainly effective. Look at what you did to my makeshift weapon. Parts of her rod had become weakened and corroded by dark splotches. While it had not snapped in half or anything, it most definitely looked like it had seen better days. Chapter 7164. Short of True Mastery. After concluding an exploratory spar, Ketty's developed a good understanding of V's upgraded combat prowess. The Swordmaster was a scary opponent to fight against. Perhaps VS could crush her if he unfolded his true body and tanked her powerful blows, but he saw no way he could beat her if he restricted himself to infantry scale. VS always heard many praises about her combat prowess, but it was only when he faced her with a weapon of his own that he understood the gulf between her and other fighters. Swordmasters were serious business. Even if they had become mostly obsolete by the time humans adopted mechs and warships as their preferred combat platforms, that did not diminish the lethality of Swordmasters in the slightest. VS could not imagine how much scarier it would be if he faced her while she was wielding her Bloodsinger or her Heavensward as opposed to a random metal rod. He gained a lot more respect for Ketty's for this reason. Now that he had gained the fighting skills of a demonic possession spearman, he understood a lot better how much time and dedication it took to become so good at swordsmanship. And she still had enough time left over to become a journeyman mech designer. He knew that it was almost impossible for him to defeat her in terms of pure skill anytime soon, if ever. His new fighting method did not rely at all on developing superior weapon handling skills, but instead took a detour and relied on the unconventional magic of demonic possession to surprise and overwhelm opponents. It followed a completely different philosophy that could no longer be regarded as a pure martial pursuit. The inclusion of demonology elements irrecoverably tainted it and turned the art of wielding weapons into a vessel to channel the power of potent demons. Although victory could justify all means as long as the enemy managed to counter his demons or he lacked access to powerful enough ones, his ordinary spearmanship skills would not carry him far against truly challenging opponents. The feedback issued by Kedis basically confirmed his own evaluation. You have become a serviceable fighter. Your technical fighting skills alone are equivalent to that of a professional spearman mech pilot with several years of training and preparation under his belt. She gently praised. You are probably good enough to join an elite mech unit as a fresh recruit. Your foundation is solid and you know your theory well. I sense a but coming. The female journeyman gave him an encouraging smile. You are not a true fighter vs. I do not mean this as an insult. I am just stating the truth in my professional capacity as a swordmaster. Technical skill alone is not enough to become a qualified warrior. While I know that you have shed blood in person on multiple occasions, you lack the killer instinct, the drive to defeat every opponent, the determination to master your weapons to the limit, and so on. Since you have gained these skills through an enlightenment fruit as opposed to working for them the hard way, you lack true appreciation of how far you have come. A more vain and prideful person might feel insulted by her criticism, but VS did not feel much hurt. She was right. VS still did not think of himself as a true fighter despite gaining the skills to qualify as one. That is fair, he said. I absorbed this powerful enlightenment fruit to turn the Dark Apostle into a competent fighter. The fact that I have mastered the same skills as well is just a bonus as far as I am concerned. I will definitely be able to design better spearman mechs in the future. I would not say that you have attained true mastery over your technical skills. Kedis shook her head. Let me put it this way. As a chef, you have learned how to execute the standard recipes to a high degree of proficiency, but that does not necessarily turn you into a master chef. A true pursuer of the culinary arts has developed his own style or signature, his own taste as it were. He also knows how to adapt the static recipes to the actual circumstances. For example, variations in ingredients and differences in climate may compel him to increase the proportion of vegetables and decrease the amount of seasoning applied to a dish. The end result clearly deviates from the standard recipe, but customers undoubtedly prefer its taste over one that has rigidly stuck to written instructions. Do you understand? This was a simple enough analogy to understand for VS. I understand. The enlightenment fruit has only given me instruction on how to execute the most standard and impersonalized form of demonic possession spearmanship. It has not given me any assistance when it comes to bridging the gap between standard practice and personalization. I still have a long way to go if I want to adapt and optimize this art until I have developed my own fighting style. Kedis smiled and nodded in approval. You have the right idea. This is a lesson that every sword maiden and heavensworder receives early on. We have never insisted that sword practitioners must rigidly adhere to the exact specifications of every sword style or technique. That is folly. We are not raising bots. We are raising warriors. There is good sense in drilling the basics without too much deviation, but past an acceptable level of proficiency, sticking to rigid standards will do more harm than good as far as I am concerned. Mind you, not every fighter agrees with this stance. There are outfits that have made a strong focus on standardization work. They mostly filter out fighters who deviate too much from the uniform standards. Do this often enough and you are only left with those who work well following the exact same standards. I do not think I can stand such treatment. VS threw out a guess. That is right. Kedis gave him a measuring stare. You are far too individualistic both as a person and a fighter. This is why my evaluation of you is so critical. There is an enormous gap between high proficiency and high mastery. You can only claim to master the art of wielding a spear if you have truly spent your training on personalizing what you have learned before testing your results against actual opponents. If you are willing to make this commitment, then I estimate that you can defeat most ascended giants if everything else is equal. What about their champions? You still stand little chance against them, she flatly said. I do not know too much about them, but from what little I can gather, every candidate of the Phase Lord department has to be an elite soldier or warrior from the onset. After all, the Red Collective wants to get its money's worth. It makes little sense to pump so much phase water into the bodies of mediocre combatants. The leaders and champions among them are definitely a cut above the rest. Their skills undoubtedly reached a higher level of mastery, but that is only a part of the story. They most likely possess talents that are rare or innate that put them ahead of others. Their intangibles are also far superior to your own. This is a gap that you cannot close unless you set everything aside and fully dedicate yourself to the art of combat in the next several decades. That was clearly impossible. For all of his exuberance about becoming a skilled and competent fighter, the pursuit of combat mastery did not hold as much attraction as becoming a master mech designer. I will leave that up to the Dark Apostle. VS dismissively waved his hand as he refused to do so much work only to benefit another person. Let me ask you this. Do you think that my weapon skills are good enough to defeat the 4 leaders of the Phase Lord department if I combine them with other advantages such as the demonology stuff and superior tech? Kedis shrugged. Who knows? I can't say anything for certain when I have so little information. My guess is that you have raised yourself to a competitive level. The outcome of the leadership challenge is no longer heavily against your favor. While I do not think you have much of a chance against a former Galaxy-class boxing champion like the oscillating fist, achieving victory against the other 3 ascending giants should be well within your reach. That was enough for VS. He smiled as he gripped his fist. He could sense the raw power that he could now command. One of the biggest benefits of the Enlightenment Fruit was that he was able to draw upon Lucky's power more actively. To be more precise, Blinky was able to channel a lot more E-energy from his imaginary universe. While VS had yet to test the new limits on E-energy transmission, he already felt that he had acquired his own miniature spark reactor. Just like how the spark reactors made dreadnoughts so formidable on the battlefield, VS had the potential to punch far above weight so long as he leveraged the much more accessible output of the Blinkyverse to the fullest. There was so much E-energy stuffed inside the enormous internal universe that VS never had to worry about running out during any combat engagement. Since Blinky had begun to cultivate the imaginary universe method version 3.0 that his mother had customized for him, the companion spirit had been absorbing incoming E-energy radiation day and night. With so much reserves, Blinky's effectiveness as an innate demon was mainly limited by his improved throughput. Of course, not everything was optimistic. Due to his abnormal conditions, VS did not turn into a demonic possession spearman. He had already deviated from the standard recipe from the onset. Blinky was a companion spirit, not an innate demon, and that changed a lot of stuff. The hybrid fighting method that he learned from the Enlightenment Fruit may be versatile enough to accommodate many different situations, but VS did not think its original creator had ever accounted for this possibility. As a positive life form, Blinky lacked certain traits that were common in demons. VS understood that many power moves would not work at all or become only a fraction as effective as they should, even accounting for regular adaptations. He, or rather the Dark Apostle, would have to spend a lot of time on testing them out and puzzling why they did not work properly. Then he needed to devise his own solutions and continue to test them until he was able to perform his extraordinary spear techniques at an acceptable degree of potency. In short, VS and the Dark Apostle needed to pay the price for deviating from the standard formula of demonic possession spearmanship so much. It would be worth it in the end. Blinky might not be able to replicate all of the features of a demon, but he possessed properties that no demon could equal. VS had little expectation of being able to explore these new possibilities in time for the upcoming leadership challenge, but that did not stop him from imagining how much more versatile he would become in the distant future. So is this everything you need from the system? Gloriana asked at the end. Yes. VS confidently replied. More boosts are welcome, but strictly speaking, I have everything I need from the system to give me a realistic chance of winning the upcoming duels. Now I need to spend my remaining time on building up my war gear. I can channel my newfound skills and abilities much better if I have the right weapons and armor at my disposal. I hope that the RC has plenty of high-grade hypermaterials on hand. I am going to need a lot of them in order to channel my newfound skills to the greatest extent at this time. Chapter 7165. Dulo's Input. VS exited the system space with renewed determination. He finally addressed a major shortcoming that diminished his chances of winning the leadership challenge. That did not mean that victory was about to fall on his lap. He still had to work for this outcome. It just became a lot more accessible to him than before. That was all he could ask for under the circumstances. One of the first actions he took after he exited the system space was to revise his equipment designs and alter his demands to the Red Collective. He added further specifications to the raiments that the Red Collective was supposed to develop for him for the upcoming fights. Now that he became a competent spear wielder, he knew a lot more about which armor sections needed additional layers and which ones had to be slimmed down to facilitate his moments. Not every spear wielder fought in the same manner. The fighting style imparted by the last Enlightenment Fruit was fairly expressive in terms of moves and techniques. It was excellent for dueling as it incorporated far more than simple stabs. In order to perform all of the spins and other wide sweeps with a fairly lengthy polearm, it was best if the raiment did not get in the way or worse limit his range of motion. Meeting his demand did not come without a cost. His raiments had to forego adequate protection in numerous areas such as the armpits and such, but there was not much he could do about it if he wanted to fight without his armor getting in the way. What was more important was that VS wanted his raiments to provide greater support for channeling his abilities. The two Enlightenment Fruits granted him many new ways to turn his power into powerful effects. His gear could either hinder or complement his new fighting methods, and it was best if the latter happened more often than the former. There was not enough time for VS and the RC to test everything out and develop the most optimal set of equipment for a deviant demonic possession spearman. They all had to make do with lots of guesswork. As a mech designer, VS understood how frustrating it was to work on short notice with frustratingly little solid criteria, but he was in the same position. His sparring session with Keddies enlightened him to many different aspects about his new fighting style, but he still did not have a more complete overview of what he was capable of. He still had to make a lot of adjustments and adaptations to how he executed his techniques in order to make them work with a non-demonic entity such as Blinky. There was not enough time for him and the Dark Apostle to complete this enormous endeavor in a short amount of time. The best they could do was to pick the low-hanging fruit and solve the problems that hindered them from executing the simplest and most straightforward techniques. Anything fancy or more specialized had to wait until much later when the leadership challenge had already passed. VS was not too worried. He believed the simpler fighting techniques should be enough to tide him over. He would just have to rely on his equipment to make up for the difference. He had great confidence that he could enter the dueling ground with much better gear than any of his opponents. Ever since the Phase Lord Department became estranged from the Red Collective, it had ceased to receive any resupplies. Its headquarters no longer received any Phase Water exotics hypers and so on. Its scientists and engineers also lost access to the Red Collective's internal network, which meant that they could no longer keep up with the latest R&D advancements made by the collies. Sure, the headquarters had already been supplied with a lot of riches prior to its isolation, but these were known quantities that could only be stretched up to a point. VS was not arrogant enough to assume that the leaders of the Phase Lord Department did not make their own preparations. Their gear was probably receiving last-minute upgrades as best as their staff could accomplish given the limited conditions. VS and the collies just had to ensure that they did a much better job. Their conditions were so much better that there was no excuse if his weapons and armor did not have an obvious gap with the gear used by his upcoming adversaries. In order to help him develop a better set of spears for his upcoming duels, he called over Dulo Voikin and brought the EdNet graduate up to speed. The journeyman mech designer scratched his head in utter perplexement. I knew that the new frontier had changed far more than any one of us could have imagined during the time I was studying how to design first-class mechs in the EdNet, but this is something else. This doesn't make any sense. How have you managed to become so good at spear fighting? I may not be a fighter, but my eyesight is not poor. There is no way you could have trained in spears until you have reached this level of proficiency in the few years that has passed. It is impossible no matter how ridiculous systematic cultivation has turned out. There is a limit to how much you can defy the laws of reality. VS knew it was difficult to explain to Dulo how he suddenly became so good at combat, and he did not intend to offer a reasonable explanation at all. With his current status and prestige, he could get away with keeping people in the dark. He did not need an informed Dulo. He needed a compliant Dulo. VS casually brushed aside the other mech designer's questions and proceeded to explain his initial plan for the 4 spears he intended to design for every duel. Once Dulo Voikin's attention shifted to the weapon concepts, he became a lot more focused now that they were talking about his area of expertise. I have a lot of comments, he said as he scrutinized the projected weapon designs. First, a plasma spear handles much differently from a solid alloy spear. Your maneuverability will also be enormously impacted by the heavy reactor module mounted on your back. Are you sure you are willing to commit to a restricted fighting style during your first duel? VS nodded. Yes. The Unshakable King is a defensive powerhouse. It is unlikely that he will change his entire fighting approach for this upcoming duel. Besides, adopting a different combat approach for the first duel should catch the Fiery Axe by surprise when I fight against her with a completely different loadout and fighting approach. I see. I can understand the strategy behind your decision, but one of the revelations you have made is that you are able to channel powerful darkness abilities with your spear. I do not see how you can facilitate this when your equipment loadout for the first duel is so heavily slanted towards the use of a plasma spear. Shouldn't there be a contradiction between the darkness element and plasma weapons? That was a valid observation and one that VS had already thought about. That is why I intend to augment my gear with fire hypermaterials Dulo. This will be a high-energy loadout where I want my plasma spear to burn as hot as possible. The raiment should also be equipped with energy-intensive tech in order to make good use of that big reactor. Mobility is not as important as other criteria. Dulo frowned. That is a risky strategy. What if the Unspeakable King proves more mobile than expected? Well, I can always purge my armor and restore my mobility. VS shrugged. I am not too worried about this possibility. What if your strategy fails to be decisive enough? For all of the merits of your plasma spear, phase lords are notoriously tough. VS began to smirk in response. That is why I intend to add another surprise to my weapon. I have recently learned how to turn hypermaterials and more specifically fire hypermaterials into volatile explosives. Let me give you the details. The other mech designer became more and more astonished when VS gave an example of how he could turn a solid hyper product into a potent bomb. This is impressive tech. Dulo said. I can especially see how valuable it is when employed in spears. They are easy to produce and throw. Why insist on turning your plasma spear into a self-detonating projectile? Are you not afraid that it will accidentally blow up before it was supposed to do that? Why not carry additional javelins that are made for this purpose? The mass allowance for the duel is pretty tight. I do not want to weaken my raiment or my plasma spear just so that I can carry a handful of exploding spears on my back. I also do not think that weaker weapons can inflict enough damage against a defensive specialist. I need to whittle down the Unshakable King's defenses before I can attempt to launch a killing blow. It is best if the detonation is powerful enough to take away his life. His treasonous ideas are intolerable to me. Causing the plasma spear to explode in front of his face, especially when he completely did not expect it, may be enough to finish the job. And what if this defensive specialist managed to survive this powerful strike? That is what the backup knife is for. VS smirked. Unlike the plasma spear, this will be a solid alloy blade, so I will augment it with darkness hypermaterials. If the duel has already reached this stage, then I expect that the reactor has largely exhausted itself. I may have purged it sooner for one reason or another. While it is risky to get close to the unshakable king, I believe I have a good chance of finishing him off if he has already suffered a lot of damage from my prior attacks. This was the least reliable part about his game plan for the first duel. A backup knife was not a great weapon, especially in the hands of a fighter who only knew how to wield polearms with skill. Demonic possession spearmanship worked best when fighting with a spear. A knife lacked the reach and other properties that could help with channeling a large variety of offensive power moves. However, there were still a handful of simple tricks that VS could perform with a knife after he made a number of adjustments. The effects wouldn't particularly be strong, but the magnitude should be significant enough to make a difference. If the Dark Apostle still was not able to finish off the unshakable king at that point, then he may as well give up and allow his opponent to claim victory. As Dulo took in the information, he raised his finger and began to apply additions and modifications to the plasma spear. Lucky for you, one of the subjects that I have studied is the application of plasma technology in spear-type weapons. Your draft design is not bad, but the Red Association has mastered more advanced plasma spear templates that offer superior containment and fault tolerance. Your plasma edge is much less likely to fizzle out if we redesign the internals of these mechanisms. Dulo put the knowledge he had learned during EdNet training to good use. His revised plasma spear design was indeed a lot safer and less prone to malfunctions. Of course, his renewed design relied a lot on rare and exclusive materials as well as tech that was exclusive to the Red Association. It was not so easy to develop such a weapon without the support of a technologically advanced organization. Everything was connected in a way. The Red Association's technological superiority was based on a broad basis of supporting tech. The same applied to the Cybernetic Empire, but to a much greater degree. Chapter 7166. The Value of a Second Perspective. It had been worth it to put Dulo Voikin through EdNet training. Though he missed out on a lot of events during the last few years, he had spent a decade and a half on learning everything he needed to design the best first-class spearman mechs. He knew exactly what he wanted to become. He wanted to excel in designing spearman mechs just like how Kedis excelled at designing swordsman mechs. The problem was that Dulo was not able to become a combat master like the Sword Maiden mech designer. He could only make up for the gap in other ways. His chosen solution was to learn all of the tech related to spears and spearman mechs and nothing else. By maintaining such a narrow focus, Dulo lacked the qualifications to design rounded first-class multipurpose mechs. His expertise in high-tech ranged weapon systems was very inadequate compared to his other competences. However, he made up for his lack of versatility by deepening his specialization to a greater depth than generalists managed to learn. VS may be able to design a decent first-class spearman mech, but Dulo could completely outclass him on this front. That made Dulo's help so valuable this time. Even if they were working on Phase Lord equipment as opposed to spearman mechs, many of the principles remained similar enough that his expertise was still very much relevant and useful. It took remarkably little time to reconfigure the plasma spear design. Dulo replaced many vulnerable electronics and mechanisms with miniaturized versions that were smaller and far better shielded than the alternatives. The cost and resource demands of the weapon rose sharply, but the projected performance gains were also undeniable. VS gained considerably greater confidence in his ability to defeat the unshakable king with a stronger and sturdier weapon at his disposal. The greatest complication with the weapon project was to make it so that the plasma spear could explode with the greatest possible force. Dulo had to deviate from the standard template and make the capacitors more energy-dense and prone to violent discharges upon command. He also had to incorporate the strange arrangement of fire hypermaterials that would turn into an explosive material when charged in the right way. VS and Dulo worked together to puzzle out the solutions to these complicated technical problems in the shortest possible time span. They drew upon external resources such as spare processing power and advice from technical consultants in order to complete their work as quickly as possible. Hours passed by until they completed the initial design of a unique plasma spear. This is not even its final form. VS grinned in anticipation. Dulo winced. Do you truly have to apply this experimental demonization process onto such a beautiful weapon? The plasma spear is already powerful enough in my eyes, and its capacity for self-destruction is already significant. I fear your strange treatment may corrupt the mechanisms and disable crucial components that are essential to its operation. That won't happen. VS reassured him. The treatment will mutate the weapon. That is unavoidable. It will not cause the weapon to lose its core functionality. The process somehow adapts to the properties of the original object. It is meant to enhance the weapon, not disable it. Besides, if you are correct and the special treatment has somehow resulted in too many flaws, we can always recycle it and fabricate a second plasma spear. Red Collective will cover the additional expenses and resource requirements. It was nice to know that the big superorganization was willing to cover all of the expenses and open up a part of its strategic material reserves. The plasma spear already incorporated a small collection of those luxurious high-grade materials that were not available in the open market. Much of it happened to comprise of high-grade hypermaterials that the RC produced through artificial means. The production methods encompassed more than just piling lots of hypermaterials of a single element while placing normal materials in the vicinity that had the potential to evolve into superior forms of hypermaterials. At this level, the Kalis employed elaborate rituals and chi formations that concentrated and regulated the flow of E-energy. It was all fascinating and troublesome. Whatever the case, VS and Dulo crammed as much of the good stuff into the plasma spear design as they could. This was not always possible, as an excessive concentration of high-grade hypermaterials vastly increased the probability of accidents and unwanted reactions. They had to be reasonable and mix in a modest amount of mid-grade hypers as well as exotics that possessed stabilizing properties. Only by combining the strengths and weaknesses of different materials together were they able to complete the design of a plasma weapon that held great promise, but also preserved enough reliability to withstand the rigors of the only battle it was meant to be used. It is a pity. Dulo sighed. This is such a powerful weapon that it is too much of a waste to blow it up in the same battle it is debuting. I do not want the first high-end spear that I have designed since I have graduated from EdNet training to have such a short lifespan. Is there any way for you to keep it longer? VS shook his head. Unlikely. The Dark Apostle will have to dominate the first duel in order to make the final solution redundant, and I do not see that happening when fighting against an opponent of this caliber. The Unshakable King is long regarded as the second strongest human phase lord currently in existence. The fact that he is not able to challenge the Oscillating Fist directly is not a sign of weakness. The latter is just too strong. Against my phase lord self, the Unshakable King will definitely have an easier time. Only by doing the unexpected and triggering my plasma spear to explode do I have a chance to crack his formidable defenses. Though Dulo looked regretful after hearing that, it was not as if his opinion could change anything. They moved on to developing the second spear for the next duel. This was a different weapon for a different occasion. The Fiery Axe was a human phase lord who was famed for being able to launch crushing and burning axe strikes. Her unrelenting offensive prowess forced many ascended giants who were weaker or at the same level to go on the defensive and do everything in their power not to get struck by her continuous strikes. VS did not want to confront such an opponent directly. He chose to rely more on mobility, which meant that his raiment had to be lighter than usual while equipped with a relatively powerful flight system. The good news was that all of this lightweight equipment left open a lot of mass for weapons. However, equipping the Dark Apostle with too many heavy weapons would clearly weigh him down, causing him to lose a lot of mobility and make it harder to evade incoming attacks. In order to make full use of the mass allowance while making sure to preserve as much mobility as possible, Dulo made a slightly inventive proposal. Segmentation is the answer, he said as he began to draft a spear with a long shaft. Who says that you have to deploy into the field with a single solid weapon? You can choose to arm yourself with a spear that is modular. Each section can be separated upon command. He proceeded to draw lines across the shaft to show how the weapon could be segmented. You can adjust the length of the spear by adding or removing segments. If you have a need of greater reach, you can add them to the shaft. If you need greater mobility, you can remove these dense and heavy segments and gain a lighter and more handy weapon in return. What is important is that you have the option to change the configuration of your weapon at any time. The idea sounded intriguing. VS could see how it could work, especially for a solid alloy spear that originally did not incorporate any electronics. What do I do with the shaft segments that I have no use for? He asked. I can't just carry them around. They will just weigh me down and mitigate the mobility gains from removing them from the spear. Dulo shrugged. You can just toss them aside. Leave them floating around somewhere. If you need them again, you can go back to them and slot them back onto your spear. Wait, if you incorporate that self-exploding hypertech into this weapon design, you can even turn them into makeshift hand grenades. During critical exchanges, you can disconnect a segment and toss them into the Fiery Axe at close range, where it is much more difficult for her to defend against this move. A critical explosion at the right time can create openings and help you land the killer blow. Of course, you can also toss your entire spear at your opponent and hope that the detonation will be powerful enough to win the duel outright. Those were great ideas. VS wouldn't have been able to come up with these ideas on his own. This instance showed how valuable a second perspective could be, especially from a mech designer who knew his craft. The idea of segmenting his high-penetration spear had many possible applications. It added a lot of versatility and truly rounded out his equipment configuration for the second duel. There was only one complication. The tech related to creating self-exploding hyperspears that I have recently acquired only works with fire hypermaterials. So, this is not going to be a plasma weapon. It will be a solid alloy spear, which means it is much more difficult to channel the power of the fire element through this weapon. Since my affinity for the darkness element is stronger than the 5 classical elements, I prefer to incorporate darkness hyper materials into this particular weapon. Dulo saw the problem now. Does that mean that self-destruction is off the table? VS smirked. Not exactly. Just because the original inventors of this tech never thought of using other types of hypermaterials to make it work does not mean we have to do the same. I am sure I can puzzle out a way to substitute fire hypermaterials with darkness hypermaterials. We don't have much time to figure it out, so the solution will probably be sloppy, messy, underpowered, and maybe not as reliable. However, as long as it can unleash a painful blast, that is all I need. They began to work on it right away. While Dulo designed the segmented spear, VS busied himself with trying to apply the principles of exploding hyperweapons to hypermaterials that were sensitive towards the darkness element. These experiments were not cheap. Darkness hypermaterials were considerably rarer and difficult to obtain. It would be painful if VS failed to produce a successful result. Fortunately, he managed to make it work, sort of. Although the resulting explosion was weaker than desired and possessed a vastly different character, VS was pleased as long as it could inflict a significant amount of damage. There was clearly a lot of room for improvement. VS wished he could spend a week optimizing his initial solution, but there was no time for that. He could only go back to Dulo and do his best to incorporate his improvised solution into the segmented high-penetration spear. Did you make sure the spear tip is as sharp as possible while still aligned with the darkness element? Yes, sir. There is only so much I can do with transphasic alloys, but I found a good combination that blends well with this type of high-grade hypermaterials. The only problem is that the tip has to be thicker and more reinforced, as that sharpness comes at the cost of toughness. That is okay. Chapter 7167. Quick Resolution, Mass Release Day, April 5th. As VS and Dulo continued with their collaboration, they gained plenty of inspiration from their current work. The plasma spear was an exquisite weapon that could be used as the basis of a first-class spearman mech design or even a first-class multipurpose mech design for the Larkinson clan in the future. They just needed to scale it down and substitute the rarest materials for more common ones in order to make it suitable for mass production. The only feature that VS was not sure about removing was the self-exploding aspect. Other people could not detonate the weapon willy-nilly. They needed to practice and master the right cultivation technique. This was doable, but not in the short term. Any mech pilot that wanted to master the capability to throw exploding weapons had to cultivate the requisite steps in order to make proper use of this feature. Without a suitable wielder who mastered this capability, the spears simply wouldn't explode as desired. It would be a waste to design all of those extra complications. The Larkinsons would be better off if they made use of regular spears instead. In fact, the same rules applied even if Xanther Larkinson sought to master this amazing new tech. He may be able to adapt the tech to kinetic projectiles, but as long as they needed to be primed by the mech pilot beforehand, it became a lot harder to use them in combat. Oh well. If Xanther was unable to automate this process, then at worst the Larkinsons could raise a special mech battalion that was filled with ranged specialists who worked hard to master the necessary technique to prime their projectiles to explode. As VS and Dula finalized the design of the segmented high-penetration self-exploding transphasic darkness hyperspear, they finally turned their attention to the equipment configuration for the third duel. The Divine Harpoon is one of the lesser threats according to our analysis and predictions. VS explained to Dulo. That doesn't mean we have to take him lightly. Regardless of how much resistance he puts up, he will definitely ensure that we have to work towards our victory. Since he specializes in throwing harpoons, I do not want to bet on whether the Dark Apostle will be able to evade his signature harpoons. That requires way too much experience and skill. It is better to just assume that the harpoons will land on their targets. What we need to ensure is that my other self is able to withstand this blow. He waved at the projection that showed a draft design of a heavy raiment paired with a short spear and an oval physical shield. This was a fairly defensive configuration where the physical shield was clearly designed to block as many harpoons as possible before it inevitably got wrecked. I understand your intentions, Dulo said as he scrutinized the depicted gear. I have one question. Do you have any special demands for the spear that you carry into this battle? There is only one real demand, and that is that it needs to be fairly light. I intend to allocate most of my mass budget for this duel into beefing up the oval shield and the frontal armor of the raiment. It is absolutely critical that the Dark Apostle can withstand all of the harpoon strikes. Static defense is not a real solution. VS. Harpoons are often attached to chains or wires that enable the thrower to pull them back. The Divine Harpoon can keep retrieving and reusing the same harpoons. At worst, their tips may degrade due to repeated impacts to your defenses, but if you do not cut off their connections to their owner, they will continually strike at you. Normally, I would suggest that you try to close the distance as much as possible, but that is not feasible if your thick defenses are compromising your mobility. Dulo indeed raised a good point, but VS had an answer to this. I will try to utilize my new fighting techniques to degrade the harpoons thrown by the leader of the Faceless Giants. The power of darkness is good at weakening and corroding everything it touches. I will make sure that the raiment and the physical shield will not let a single harpoon go unscathed after making contact. VS had a bit more confidence in this as his prior experiments gave him a better insight in what kind of damage he could do with the darkness element. Okay, sir. I will take your word on it. If the harpoons can be dealt with, then this armored configuration may still work. It is likely that the divine harpoon will close in on you and attempt to beat you in close combat when he is down to a single harpoon. I know. That is okay. I am more than prepared to fight against him up close. At worst, I will purge a bit of my armor if that is hindering my movements. I am not too afraid of losing against him in this circumstance. If that is the case, do you truly need to equip yourself with a different weapon from the last duel? Huh? Dulo summoned a projection of the segmented high-penetration spear that they had just completed a short time ago. We can dynamically lengthen and shorten this weapon by adding and removing segments. If we cut this spear down to size, it will become much lighter but still remain a serviceable weapon that you can wield in a single hand. My advice is that instead of working hard to design a new spear, we can simply reuse this one. We can still abide by the mass limit by bringing in less segments than last time. What do you think? Although the choice of reusing the same kind of weapon was not entirely optimal, VS did not have much objections to this idea. Sure, the tip of the high-penetration spear was extremely lethal and might easily kill the divine harpoon by accident. That was bad because there was plenty of proof that he was the most pro-human ascended giant among his kind. If VS did not have enough confidence in the Dark Apostle's ability to avoid a killing blow, then it may be better to equip a less lethal armament. Maybe we should look into increasing the toughness of the spear tip at the cost of reducing its lethality. VS suggested. We can do that, but I still think that you should retain the original specifications. The sharp tip is excellent at carving through armor. It can also inflict serious damage to the body of a phase lord whenever you desire. It is better to have the option available to you than not in the event that the divine harpoon is unexpectedly more powerful than you thought. A sharper spear tip can also be used to degrade the harpoons used by your enemy. You only need to exercise more control if you want to avoid any unintended fatalities. It took a bit of persistence, but Dulo successfully convinced VS to reuse their previous work, though with a number of modifications to make it more fitting for the third duel. It was quite difficult to figure out the divine harpoon's complete combat routine. Most of the footage and talk centered around him gushed over his harpoon throws. It was unclear how good he was in close quarters combat. In any case, the work on preparing the armaments for the third duel concluded rather quickly as a result. VS banked much on the quality and the performance of his raiment and physical shield, but he was not directly involved in their development. He could only hope that the collies would be able to do a good job and ensure they could resist and degrade the projectiles thrown by the divine harpoon. VS and Dulo finally turned to the fourth and final duel. This was the one that VS considered virtually unwillable, so he decisively scheduled it as the last duel. He really hoped that it would not be necessary to win against the foremost fighter and leader of the Ascended Giants. The most recent upgrades gave him much greater confidence in the Dark Apostle's fighting power, but he may still end up losing once or twice. That meant that VS needed to have a loadout that could give him a realistic chance of winning the fight. Yet letting the oscillating fist get close and giving him an opportunity to pummel the Dark Zephyr was extremely dangerous. This was why VS decided to adopt a completely different strategy for this fight. I want this duel to unfold quickly and end on a fast note if I have failed to take him down quickly, he stated. In order to accomplish this, I intend to enter the dueling ground while carrying a pair of lances. Blast lances, to be more precise. That caused Dulo to grow enthused. This was familiar territory for him. You mean the same kind of blast lances used by my Red Lance mechs? Yes, but we'll be making use of upgraded versions. We can readily apply the exploding tech we have applied in the earlier weapons that we have worked on. These lances need to blow up with the greatest possible force upon impact as possible. They need to rely on a combination of high momentum and powerful explosions to strip the oscillating fist's spatial barrier in the first impact and hopefully inflict a crippling blow in the next impact. To that end, the Dark Apostle will be equipped with a medium raiment that is paired with a powerful linear flight system. This was a risky configuration but had the potential to finish the duel in the fastest and most explosive manner. Although it was a bit cowardly to avoid prolonged contact with the oscillating fist, VS hoped that the Ascended Giants would still be happy with all of the spectacle produced by the explosive lances. Dulo looked intrigued. I think it has a chance of working, especially if you reserve enough mass for the 2 lances. The only detail that I find questionable is whether you can finish the job with just 2 lances. Isn't it safer to carry 3 or 4? Even if they are smaller, you can still make adjustments in case your initial charge attack failed to deplete your opponent's spatial barrier. If it is still left intact, then your final blast lance will probably be able to destroy it entirely but leave your opponent's armored body relatively unscathed. Carrying more blast lances can help with this situation. You are right, Dulo, but I don't want to take too many chances. 2 charges are enough. Any more and the oscillating fist may be able to launch a counterattack that can disrupt my approach. This battle must start quickly and end quickly before any further complications can arise. 2 blast lances has to do the job. One must be extremely good at breaking apart spatial barriers. The other must excel at eating through armor and compromising the body of the Phase Lord. What if the 2 blast lances successfully inflicted heavy injuries to the oscillating fist but failed to force him into defeat? Then, VS hesitated. Depending on his condition, the Dark Apostle may choose to engage him up close with a backup knife in an attempt to finish the job. The oscillating fist relies on a strong and healthy body to exert the utmost of his potential. If his body is compromised, his greatest weapon has also become compromised. He won't be as scary as before. At least that is what I hope. His alter ego needed to make a very important judgment call. If the oscillating fist still had a decent amount of fight left into him, then it was highly inadvisable to engage him up close. All in all, this game plan was hardly perfect, but it was the best that VS could come up with. The next best option was to equip himself with a rifle or a cannon, but that was too dishonorable in the eyes of the Ascended Giants. By the way, sir, do you even know how to perform charging attacks like Lancer Mechs? Not really, but it shouldn't be too difficult, right? Chapter 7168. The Importance of the Marigal Organ. Days came and went in sooner than everyone wished. The Red Collective worked hard to prepare for the first major crisis it had gotten caught up in since its founding. The Larkin Sons also worked hard to realize the promise of effectively taking control over one of the strongest and most formidable fighting forces of Red humanity. Much was at stake. Those in the know paid a lot of attention to this event. Many more parties had secretly planted listening devices and other spying equipment around Jotunheim. The icy planet that orbited far from the 3 stars had become a focal point in Red humanity's history. Throughout all of this growing interest and scrutiny, the Larkin Sun clan played it cool. This was not the first time that VS and the Larkin Sons had found themselves at the center of a storm. They bore the scrutiny with practiced ease, as they understood that it was pointless to engage with third parties. The Red Collective needed to solve this crisis internally, which meant that every source of help had to be routed through its channels first. It would be inappropriate for the Larkin Sons to accept deals in exchange for concessions related to the Phase Lord department. Whether the Larkin Sons could succeed in this endeavor remained to be seen. Few people expressed confidence in a mech designer's ability to defeat not just one but several professional warriors and champions in back-to-back duels. The entire leadership challenge did not even make sense to most people. How could a department as big and powerful as the Phase Lord department be so idiotic to put its leadership up for grabs by giving it to the person with the biggest fist? This was barbarism. Such a phenomenon was a powerful indicator that Red humanity was regressing as a society. The more the madness of the Red Ocean seeped into the human consciousness, the more the human race deviated from the standards of the Milky Way. Many people grew concerned about this trend. A growing number of people came to believe that only strength mattered in this dangerous dwarf galaxy. When the rules of the jungle took primacy over the rule of law, it was the savages that held all of the power, not the scholars. Too many Red humans couldn't accept such a reality, yet their very own lack of power left them helpless to stop this trend. So long as the native aliens and the mutated Vorabugs remained a civilization-ending threat, there was no way to stop the rise of a new breed of leaders. It remained to be seen whether VS Larkin Sun could transcend his origins as a mech designer and join the rising class of warriors. The fact that a mech designer was able to become a fighter king of sorts should have been a ludicrous notion, but he was not the first to distinguish himself in this way. With Kedis as the pioneer and forerunner, the notion that VS could follow in the footsteps of his former student did not sound as unrealistic as it should. That said, many people still doubted whether he could succeed in the leadership challenge. There was only so much that superior gear could make up the difference in combat prowess. History was rife with smaller armies defeating larger ones, outdated warships trouncing modern equivalents, and cheaper mechs humiliating more high-end machines. All of these examples proved that factors such as skill, grit, willpower, training, discipline, morale, experience, and many other intangibles were just as important, if not more. As a mech designer who never went through serious combat training, VS Larkin Sun should still be an amateur in terms of combat. How could he possibly defeat the likes of the Unshakable King and the Oscillating Fist? The Red Collective had done its best to recruit a strong batch of candidates among a large pool of top infantry combatants. It had definitely not slacked off or allowed nepotism to allow unqualified warriors to get selected ahead of much more qualified soldiers. Yet the current chief counselor of the Upper Council still chose to persist, which meant that he must have reasons to be confident about. Was a mech designer truly about to take over the Phase Lord department? As unrealistic as it sounded, many people couldn't help but suspect that this unlikely scenario may very well turn into a reality by the end of the day. VS was the most famous human in the Red Ocean who was not a part of a very exclusive club of Tier 1 galactic citizens by now. He had repeatedly proven his ability to succeed where many others would fail. His legendary track record forced everyone who thought this leadership challenge was initially a foregone conclusion to keep an open mind. If not for the fact that the Red Collective tried its best to avoid as much publicity as possible, a whole gaggle of starships would have arrived in orbit of Jotunheim in order to cheer VS on and maybe lend a hand if the Phase Lord department broke the agreement. As it was, the mechs and warships from the enforcement department arrived well in advance and maintained a pretty tight security perimeter around Jotunheim. They continually swept the surroundings of hard to detect spying devices and data relays. They also drove away tourists who had no business in the vicinity. Even the bulk of the Blue Jay fleet had to stay just outside the expanded security perimeter. It would not be fair for the Ascended Giants to commence their duels within the range of all of those intimidating warship gun batteries. Only the Tarask was allowed to enter into a closer orbit, and even she was forced to lock all of her weapon systems as a precaution and a gesture of goodwill. As the big day arrived, VS had been putting the final touches on all of the fabricated combat equipment. Much of it had gone through special treatment that dramatically enhanced and mutated their appearance and performance. Though VS knew that he had added a lot more complications to his war gear, he knew that he had little choice in the matter. Despite his newly acquired combat skills, he never grew conceited enough that this alone would ensure that he could beat up a bunch of giant-sized meatheads. It was better to be safe than sorry. Although VS regretted that he did not have enough time to apply more powerful transformations to his weapons and armor, he did not become dissatisfied with the results. The treatments were relatively modest compared to what he could have made instead. The mutations fell within a reasonable range of tolerance and the risk of backlash remained small. Even if his new gear tried to cause any problems, his newly acquired knowledge granted him plenty of ways to manage the situation. His family stayed close to him in the final hour before he was about to show up at the dueling ground. "I love you, Papa. Don't lose," Marvane said as he hugged his father's leg. VS grinned and picked up his son. "I am not planning to. I haven't spent the last few days in vain. Nobody should underestimate a mech designer who is given time and resources to prepare for his next challenge." "Meow. Lucky says that you will regret saying that when you crawl back as a loser," Andrace cheekily said as she pressed the gem cat against her chest. "I think that Papa would not undertake a challenge that he is destined to lose. I believe in Papa." Aurelia voiced her support as she held hands with her new, best friend Marigal. The humanized form of the former flower parasol did not voice any opinion, but her shining eyes betrayed ample confidence in the mech designer who reinvented her and gifted her with a new identity. "How is the latest phase water organ settling in VS? Are you still feeling off balance after the surgery?" VS wearily smiled as he rubbed his side. The new lesser Marigal organ is probably the single biggest upgrade a lesser phase lord can obtain. The difference between phase lords who have this organ and not is much more significant than I expected. It should be up there with a phase water production system in terms of importance as far as I'm concerned. This organ has most certainly done its job of increasing how much of my true body can be folded into extra-dimensional space. If I maintain a compact size, my density and physical strength has increased by a sizable margin. I've become much tougher than before. How much taller have you become? Probably around 7 times the height of a mech. VS loosely estimated. There are other consequences to my heightened body mass. A lot more phase water is circulating through my true body now, though the exertion needed to maintain my extraordinary condition has grown drastically as well. I have received a modest amplification to my spatial abilities and I am better able to resist hostile abilities. However, it is the physical upgrades that matter the most. A denser and heavier true body is simply better at absorbing hits and carrying heavy stuff around. The Marigal organ was one of the key phase water organs that any martial phase lord had to acquire. It was because of this reason that it was quite a popular early upgrade for the human phase lords. Trying to fight them without this phase water organ was like fighting with a single arm. VS did not have the luxury to secure victory with this handicap. This was why he agreed to the Red Collective's urgent suggestion that he leveled the playing field by integrating this phase water organ. The surgery proceeded smoothly. VS did not undergo any weird personality changes, though he could feel his phase water concentration rising by a minute amount. His adaptation period was also much faster than usual. Normal phase lords would still feel under the weather by this time, as their bodies required a lot more time to adapt to the changes wrought by the Marigal organ. VS was an anomaly. The Kalis increasingly believed that he was truly blessed by the heavens. Of course, they were well aware that the Red Ocean's blessings always came with strings attached. The alternate personality formerly known as Sev must have gained slightly greater purchase on V's true body. The being who now accepted the identity of the Dark Apostle had been looking forward to this historic day. While that sounded great, if the Dark Apostle made any mistake, VS may be the one who paid the price. Gloriana grew concerned as she pressed her hand on his shoulder. "Try your best to rein in your dark side. As far as I am aware, the rules never accounted for your split personality, so if you concede the duel, then that should constitute a valid declaration on your end. The fighting must stop. If that does not happen, then the Ascended Giants have violated the rules." VS hadn't thought about that, but now that she brought it to his attention, he realized that she was correct. This might save his life or at least the existence of his true body during a critical moment. Thank you for the idea. I will make sure to keep it in mind. He softly responded as he leaned in to plant a kiss on her cheek. The Dark Apostle may be too much of a muscle-brained, honor-bound idiot to contemplate the idea of surrender, but I am different. I will make sure to do what is necessary. After inspecting the gear for a final time, he commanded it to get shipped to the surface of the frozen planet. The dueling ground was not very clearly defined, but from what VS could understand, the fights must always start on the surface of Jotunheim. If necessary, they could fly upwards and finish the fight in space. It all depended on how the duel unfolded. They could last up to an hour at worst. Chapter 7169. Collared Nanosuit. Both sides had set up small bases at opposite ends of a large valley. That was the site where they stashed all of their gear and set up resting and recovery facilities. Once the leadership challenge commenced, VS was not allowed to withdraw to the Tarask or any other location. He could only receive treatment on site in order to ensure that no funny business occurred. It was one of the more troublesome terms of the contract. The Ascended Giants were quite aware that the Red 3 could muster up amazing tech to help VS recover his physical injuries and exhaustion in a matter of hours. Such extravagant treatment defied the spirit of the leadership challenge and threatened to violate its sanctity. Personally, VS thought that these meatheads were putting way too much stock into honor and tradition, but then again, he was not a real warrior. Before VS prepped for battles, he received a number of pre-combat boosts. The Red Collective were determined to wring out every legitimate advantage to the fight. To that end, VS had to move to the middle of a large underground ritual chamber and feel different energies coursing through the air and into his body. He did not have a clue of what the majority of the rituals were doing. Even Blinky could not decipher the intricacies of the fine manipulation of E-energy. However, VS was roughly able to sense that he was growing stronger in subtle ways. But only subtle. The biggest disappointment about them was that the effects were not as significant as he desired. VS theorized that the enormous stature of his true body diluted the blessings by an enormous extent. Having an oversized body was not always good. VS already felt incredibly bloated due to the effects of the Marigal organ. It was as if he had multiplied in weight yet still forced himself to don a suit that was fitted to hold old size. However, this was the price that he had to pay in exchange for power. Phase Lords who accepted their departure from mortality turned this discomfort into a source of reassurance. They considered their true bodies to be their most authentic forms. They only shrunk their bodies to a more manageable scale for reasons of practicality, not because they were sentimental about their roots. In any case, after the rituals had concluded, VS did indeed feel a little stronger, sharper, more focused, and more confident. The gains would not make a notable difference if his opponent was overwhelmingly stronger than him, but it may end up becoming the deciding factor in a close match. We have done the best we can under the circumstances. Formation Master Andrea Voss walked up to VS and said, "Many of these rituals had to be adjusted in a hurry in order to accommodate a phase lord of your stature as opposed to a normal human. The differences in power and magnitude are too great. If there is one aspect that human phase lords such as yourselves are good at, it is demanding many times the resources that others normally require." VS smiled in amusement. "I can't help it. Phase lords are all like this. There is no powerful phase lord that does not have an immense body. I never asked for this, but somehow my trajectory has led to this point. At least I get to do something useful with it for once. Once you return from your first duel, our cultivators will be standing by to accelerate your natural healing process in conjunction with modern treatment facilities." The farcer proceeded to explain. "Phase lords are famed for being difficult to injure but require a great amount of time to recover from more serious wounds. We will do our best to help you recover quickly, but there is a limit to how much we can accelerate the process. You should do your best to avoid damage that has managed to penetrate past your defenses. The more physical injuries you accumulate, the more you will start the next duel at a physical disadvantage. I know. I do not intend to prolong my participation in a fight that is already lost." VS promised. "Is there anything else I should know?" "Not from our end. We have been scrying the headquarters of the Phase Lord Department and have observed no particular surprises. The Ascended Giants have not made any special preparations to ambush you to break through the blockade and flee the Central Star Node or secretly contact the Cosmopolitan Movement of the Red Cabal in order to coordinate a two-pronged attack. That said, our monitoring is hardly comprehensive, so we cannot rule out these possible actions. The Unshakable King is the greatest point of uncertainty. He is the most openly aggressive ascending giant and most sympathetic towards the Red Cabal. The leader of the most elite force of human phase lords should not be simple. That is why I am looking to duel him first." VS smirked. "He won't have time to pull off shenanigans in the dark if he is eliminated or killed in the first round. I agree with you that this guy is the greatest source of uncertainty. It makes sense to take care of him first in order to minimize the variables." They eventually entered a different room where a number of familiar faces were present. Demetrius Solclavia had arrived while wearing a gilded suit of combat armor. He looked quite impressive as the head of the enforcement department as he exuded both a martial and a regal vibe. There was little doubt to everyone that he was unquestionably in charge of this entire operation. The former Grand Marshal looked deeply at VS and apparently grew satisfied with what he saw. You have made good use of your limited time. The patient builder complimented VS. I have inspected the resources, manpower, and facilities that you have commissioned. Your needs are expensive, but we do not mind so long as you have not wasted our aid. From your eyes alone, I can see that you are ready to meet this challenge. Let us hope that you have not misjudged your chances. VS casually shrugged. What does intelligence say about my odds of winning? The secret department does not dare to make a prediction. Secret Keeper Zerial 775 spoke up from the side. It is difficult for us to accurately assess everyone's current combat power. Both of you employ secrecy and obscurity to maintain the element of surprise. We shall only find out later which side has prepared more trump cards than the other. Wow, that is helpful to hear. Not. The secret department had been helpful, but they did not do anything remarkable enough to decide the outcome of the duels. In the end, it all came down to the actual fights in order to decide the winners and losers of the upcoming duel. That was certainly exciting, but it was not how VS preferred to win his battles. He hated pitched battles. He despised giving his opponents a chance to win. He did not want to incur losses. He was a firm believer that good preparations already won most of the battles before they could even begin. VS enjoyed enough confidence in this area. However, the enemy also shouldn't be ignorant about this truth. The Ascended Giants still had enough human common sense left to get ready to do their best to maintain their leadership qualifications. By the way, have you guys completed the special solution that will allow my consciousness to linger inside Blinky when my other side has taken over? The farcer nodded and gestured for an attendant to step closer. The approaching man carried a box which automatically opened to reveal a new nanosuit with a notably thick collar. This suit is the product of several difficult days. It took great effort and ingenuity to solve your problem without enlisting outside assistance. We have ultimately managed to develop a nanosuit that contains a special transphasic alloy collar that will act as a formation anchor. It will automatically become active when you unfold your true body. A formation will run that will ensure you will remain awake in one form or another. Keep in mind that you must wear this under your raiments and ensure it incurs as little damage as possible. The collar is especially important. The alloy plating is designed to split and follow the contours of your neck, but they can still become inoperable when they have received a powerful blow. So I should never let any incoming attacks hit my neck area. Got it. Mind you, I already had this goal in mind. Another important fact that you should know is that this is just an experimental product. The Formation Master continued to warn VS. It is never designed to last more than a couple of days of intensive use. It is especially designed for you and is only meant to last for this leadership challenge. It is also designed to accommodate you as long as your true body does not grow beyond the height specified by the rules of the leadership challenge. I see. We will keep that in mind. What happens after that? We supply you with an improved version made out of superdimensional matter. Andrea Voss answered with a smile. The data that we expect to gather from your upcoming performance will help us troubleshoot and optimize the final implementation. What you will get is a collared suit that will act as a combination of a control device as well as an initial restraint. If the Dark Apostle ever goes on a rampage, this suit will help to hinder his actions long enough for reinforcements to arrive and subdue him. This should serve as a more tolerable means of keeping him under control. VS felt a bit uncomfortable about these restraints because they could theoretically pin him down as well. However, VS recognized that there was no legitimate choice for refusal. He was eager to keep the Dark Apostle in check, and so did the Red Collective. He just had to trust that the Collies would not abuse the control they gained over his true body. Hopefully VS or the others would be able to devise a more acceptable means of keeping the Dark Apostle under control. It would be best if they could be split so that they each occupied a single body once more. VS already had a small idea on how he might be able to accomplish this, but it would take a lot more waiting before he could see it come to fruition. Time is almost up, sir. Eliza M.O. Ragadon called. The Ascended Giants will be expecting you to arrive at the center of the open plains that is designated as the dueling ground. VS nodded before turning back at the Chief Enforcer. Is there anything else I should keep in mind? This is your last chance to speak to me while I am still in control over my true body. After this, the Dark Apostle will be in charge. Yes. Everything you do is political. Although we are not broadcasting this leadership challenge to the public, plenty of parties are paying varying degrees of attention to it. You represent the will of the Red Collective today. I hope your other self is careful of what he speaks. We do not want to divide our people any further. Your responsibility is to do the opposite. We must bring together a group of humans who have lost touch with their humanity. We must accept their diversity but must also ensure that they connect with their human roots. These Ascended Giants are wayward individuals. Their swing towards treachery is not their fault. Not truly. We can be magnanimous and welcome them back into our fold, but only if they do so sincerely. What if they are not in the mood to change their minds? Then I hope that as the future leader of the Phase Lord Department you can find a way to clean house without sparking total rebellion. Chapter 7170. The Meeting of Giants. VS felt slightly uncomfortable in his new nanosuit as he finally stepped outside and began to move to the center. He traveled to the center of the silent and frozen plains while standing on a large lifter platform. The industrial device was powerful enough to haul mechs from one destination to another. That was more than enough lifting capacity to accommodate a large metal crate that stored his equipment. Though VS could have opted to enter the dueling ground while wearing his new combat regalia right away, he opted to keep them under lock and key for a while longer in order to maintain the element of surprise. He also did not want his newly transformed gear to cause any incidents and potentially spark a full-blown civil war within the Red Collective. VS also arrived at the agreed-upon meeting site by himself. He brought no one else, not even Lucky. He already knew that the Ascended Giants did not respect anyone lesser than themselves. It would be an insult to bring over any puny weaklings. It would also put their lives at risk in case an outbreak of violence occurred. VS was confident in his ability to take a hit, especially after integrating the new lesser Marigal organ. The same could not be said for others. Another notable absence was Mechs. They were still visible in orbit and at certain other locations, but they made sure to remain as low-key as possible. They had been recoat so that they adopted bland and subdued colorations. They also kept their energy activity suppressed in order to appear less threatening and suspicious. All of this was designed to prove that the Red Collective was sincere about honoring the leadership challenge. Whether the RC would actually allow the Phase Lord Department to continue to operate while remaining in the hands of its current leaders remained to be seen. So long as VS still had a legitimate shot at taking it over, the RC was content to show its good side to a group of former subordinates who had betrayed their mother organization. As his large lifter platform approached the center, VS could already see that the other side had come fully prepared. Unlike VS, these Ascended Giants had already grown as tall as two mechs stacked on top of each other while putting on their full combat gear. Each of them looked resplendent in their raiments. The transphasic alloys had been polished to a shine. The distant stars might not be able to provide much illumination, but the powerful fixtures that illuminated a central plaza gave plenty of opportunities for the gigantic armor to gleam. The Ascended Giants all showed stern expressions inside their open helmets. No one else attended to them. They came with just 4 of them, as they believed they did not need any further assistance to do their jobs. Their gazes all showed varying degrees of disapproval as they observed the approach of VS in his human guise. This was a calculated display to remind them that VS was not readily willing to embrace all of their rules and traditions. He was still human. Only after the lifter platform stopped at the opposite side of the metallic plaza was VS prepared to let his other side come out to play. He took a few deep breaths. Remember what we agreed upon. Stick to the deal and you will be allowed to lead the Phase Lord Department in most matters. Not all, but enough to turn you into the leader of the Ascended Giants in truth. If you do anything that will harm the cause of red humanity, then we will put you back in the box. With that message delivered, VS finally surrendered his true body to his alter ego. His body began to inflate in size. He rapidly grew larger and taller. His nanosuit already began to stretch in order to protect his modesty and isolate him from the barren planetary environment. One notable shortcoming to his true body was that his lower left leg remained missing. He was not able to regrow it at all despite his immense physical growth and development, because he had conceptually sacrificed this limb in order to birth Veronica. Most of the time this sacrifice did not bother him. It even gave him enough room to fit a backup brain inside his psi leg. However, this physical shortcoming was a lot more consequential to a human Phase Lord. The good news was that the raiments designed for every duel already incorporated advanced cybernetic replacement legs. A considerable amount of mass had to be dedicated towards filling them up so that they turned into strengths instead of weaknesses. However, if VS found himself separated from his raiments, then the lack of a sturdy leg might prove fatal in a duel. He had to make sure that the fight took place in space where solid footing did not exist. Fighting on the surface of a planet that possessed enough gravity to press down the body of a Phase Lord was not ideal with a missing foot. The Dark Apostle quickly took over the shared true body. The shift happened instantly and seamlessly. However, VS did not disappear into the depth of the true body. The segmented collar that was wrapped around the neck of V's original body continued to do their work. Runes and symbols had been carved into the metal components and had become empowered by jewels and other hypermaterials. Each of them worked as advertised. VS found himself in possession of Blinky's spiritual form once more. "Bro, this is great. Not in my opinion," the Dark Apostle glumly whispered. "I had hoped to undertake this leadership challenge without your irritating nagging and intervention." "PFFF, keep dreaming." Blinky rolled his eyes. "You need me to keep you in line and to help you defeat these Ascended Giants." Don't forget who is responsible for infusing us both with new fighting methods. I am responsible for giving you a winning ticket. I just want to make sure that my investment is not in vain. The Dark Apostle certainly had no love for VS despite the latest gifts. The only gift he desired was to take total control over their shared true body, but the Dark Apostle knew that VS would never make this choice willingly. This was why the two would always remain in a state of subdued hostility. They knew that when either side saw an opportunity to kick the other one out, they would take it in a heartbeat. Fortunately, that day was still far away. It was more important for the both of them to cooperate in order to realize their shared goal. They could still understand this simple truth, so they did not do more than bicker for a moment before they concentrated on the matter at hand. The Polemarchos and the three Strategoi all looked at VS with slightly greater respect and acknowledgement now that the latter had matched their size. We welcome you to these sacred plains, Dark Apostle. The oscillating first greeted the arrival with an imperious voice. Today we shall decide who will get to earn the qualifications to lead the Ascended Giants as its strongest and most authoritative voice. Our people only listens to the strong, not the weak. By agreeing to undergo a leadership challenge that comprises 4 separate duels, you submit yourself to our ways and accept that true leaders can only be tested under arduous conditions. Do you agree with the terms of this challenge? The Dark Apostle made a simple nod. I do. I acknowledge how much I am putting myself behind by fighting several duels with only 3 hours of rest time in between, but this challenge wouldn't be as exciting if you gave me more time to recover from my exertion in between. The human phase lord smirked in a manner that was eerily characteristic to the normal VS. There had been plenty of debates about how separate VS and the Dark Apostle truly were in reality. Nobody could say for certain whether the latter was a completely foreign personality inserted by an external party or whether he was truly a dark reflection of the former. However, many people who were familiar with VS saw plenty of his more arrogant and outrageous traits in the Dark Apostle. It was as if the Phase Lord persona was the unfiltered and irreverent version of VS. The two sides continued to exchange words for a few more minutes. The Dark Apostle was impatient to begin, but at least a small part of him understood the importance of patience and ritual. The Phase Lord department was not in a hurry. Its leaders may be standing still, but in reality they were monitoring their surroundings carefully in case the Kali's planned to launch an ambush. This was one of the prime moments to do so. The Kalis controlled a large amount of the orbital space infrastructure. They could easily choose to launch a decapitation strike on the 4 visible leaders. That was still way too risky to execute in reality. Even if the Kalis killed the masterminds of the Phase Lord department, the many sub-leaders spread throughout space would instantly defect to any group that could give them shelter. It was due to this possibility that the Ascended Giants remained calm as they completed their necessary scans. It was not until the inspections cleared up that the Phase Lord leaders appeared ready to kick off the fighting phase. As part of the rules, you have been given the power to choose the order of your duels. Who do you intend to challenge first? The Dark Apostle raised his finger right at one of the more heavily armored Phase Lords. I challenged the Unshakable King to take part in the first duel. That surprised several of them. It was a common belief among the Ascended Giants that the man was the second strongest of all human Phase Lords that were currently in existence. For the Dark Apostle to challenge him first meant that this was a deliberate choice that was filled with meaning. The Ascended Giants grew even more serious now that they realized that their leader candidate was being utterly serious about the entire sequence. They needed to stay sharp and pay close attention if they sought to avoid getting bamboozled. The Ascended Giant slowly stepped forward while carrying a pair of impact hammers. The hammers did not look too big or exaggerated, but that made them particularly effective at inflicting repeated impact damage. These were excellent tools for breaking open transphasic energy shields. Strangely enough, the Unshakable King had opted to skip the kinetic cannon. Perhaps he thought it was too dishonorable to bring in a ranged weapon to a ritualistic duel. What a fool. Blinky assumed an air of disdain when he concluded that there was nothing in the Unshakable King's raiment or gear that would allow him to inflict damage at range. This was a particularly significant shortcoming for someone who preferred to rely on armor as opposed to speed. The Unshakable King looked at the Dark Apostle's unarmored form and frowned. Where is your war gear? Over there inside those armored containers. Do not worry. I will don them soon enough. Before we begin, I would like to ask you one question. May I? Why should I oblige? Because your answer will determine whether I will kill you or spare you if the time has come. Blinky smacked his paw against his face. The Dark Apostle wasn't supposed to reveal their plan to claim the Unshakable King's life. The only consolation was that the leader of the UR Titan Phalanx did not look surprised. He already expected that his adversary might be looking to end him in a more permanent fashion. Interesting. Ask your question then. The Dark Apostle paused for a moment before he did so. Tell me, how loose are your underpants? Chapter 71-71. The Dark Mouth Mass Release Day, May 5th. Chapter 71-71. The Dark Mouth Mass Release Day, May 5th. A very awkward silence ensued after the Dark Apostle asked his bizarre question. For a moment both humans and giants grew confused. Even VS froze after hearing his alter ego utter those outrageous words. Admirably, the unshakable king still managed to maintain his cool. His face, which looked as if it was chiseled from marble, looked completely unflappable. The only visible change was that his stare towards the Dark Apostle had intensified. "Pardon? Are you deaf? You heard what I said? How loose are your underpants beneath that thick raiment of yours? As ascended giants we grow and shrink in size in proportion to our former mortal forms. This means that if you were a big boy from the beginning, your ascended form will proportionately remain the same. So tell me, how much free space is there inside that section of armor? I bet it must be big enough to fit more than a dozen humans in that cavity. Did you use them to fill up the free space? You must have done so, or else you wouldn't have enough padding for your raiment." No response? Then you admit that the body is naturally inadequate in this area. It must have been so bad that no amount of medical treatment could have solved this congenital deficiency of yours. It appears that not even becoming a giant has remedied the shortcoming, because you wouldn't be such a shameful coward who thinks about surrendering our people to the Red Cabal. Instead of letting us rule over ourselves, you would rather sell your fellow ascended giants into slavery just so that the phase whales can appoint you as their puppet satrap. To call you a giant is a misnomer due to how frail your masculinity must be to think that serving the native aliens is the best future for our people. The unshakable king was clearly putting a great amount of effort to reflect his name. No matter what, he had to remain unmoved by the Dark Apostle's provocations. VS and many others still grew perplexed at the Dark Apostle's effort. Why would he issue such juvenile insults at this time? It was unlikely to work against an opponent of this caliber. Soldiers dealt with profanity and insults many times during their career. They might appear nothing less than professional when facing a friendly audience, but in private they could be a lot rougher underneath their uniform exterior. When VS tried to figure out this puzzle, he came up with a few theories. One reason may be to make the unshakable king angry enough to prevent him from conceding the match too soon. If the ascended giant gave up too quickly, then the Dark Apostle would lose his chance to end his opponent's life. Just because the unshakable king was used to insults did not mean he liked it. He hated the Dark Apostle a lot more than before. Another reason may be to publicly declare his stance in order to reassure VS and the Red Collective that he would not go traitor anytime soon. It was an unexpectedly clever move. Whether the Dark Apostle was sincere or not, his public declaration had committed him to this stance. Everyone would expect him to follow through on his words. In the end, the Divine Harpoon stepped forward and interceded for his troubled colleague. A leadership challenge is fought through arms, not words. Please save your accusations for when you are able to assert your leadership over us. Your words are empty so long as you have not proven yourself to be strong enough to earn our obeisance. Please arm and armor yourself. We have waited long enough. The Dark Apostle did not bother to argue with the Divine Harpoon. The challenger instead turned to the locked container that held his war gear. It slowly parted open after transmitting a command. Panels of solid and protective metal slid apart. Slowly but surely, a rack that held up a fairly heavy raiment along with a thick backpack module emerged upright from the middle of the container. The armaments also appeared upright and by the sides. The large and prominent long spear along with a slim but ominous knife completed the ensemble. Everyone grew silent as they beheld the finished works. To many people who had been able to catch a glimpse of the design schematics or was involved in the development of the raiment, the current works looked drastically different from what they had last observed. The developers of the raiment exhibited the greatest degree of shock. What is that? This is completely different from what we have made on the Chief Counselor's behalf. This raiment looks as if someone has taken our work and let a moody teenager warp it beyond recognition. The armor has sharp angles where it should have none. There is absolutely no reason for those spikes to exist. Its energy readings have also become much more volatile than before. The Flame Lord raiment was supposed to be a clean and efficient product. Despite being developed in a hurry, the Redcoat armor incorporated many best practices in the fields of infantry armor design and mech design. Although it lacked many frills such as integrated weapon modules and so on, it managed to make the best out of its limited capacity by adding in the most essential functions such as a hypershield generator based on the fire element and a strong but compact space suppressor. Much of the internals had been designed with care so that the internal architecture could best transmit the potent amount of energy produced by the reactor backpack module to the other parts of the machine, such as its flight system. The developers all became pleased at how well they managed to put their design together in so little time. To see it all perverted by an unknown influence was like a nightmare come to life. What happened? What few people noticed was Blinky's disturbingly human-like smirk. Demon casting happened. Though VS was only able to integrate a mere minor demon into the Flame Lord raiment, it was enough to elevate its performance by a small but still significant degree. The Flame Lord raiment did a better job of living up to its name. Red lines glowed across the exterior. They pulsed as if they were synchronized to a demon lord's heartbeat. The sharper angles and the decorative spikes made it look much more menacing. What was most important was that its ability to attract fire energy had improved significantly. The reactor mounted on the rear benefited greatly from this as its energy output exceeded its standard norm. Perhaps it was due to the size of this raiment, but the degree of deviations was not as exaggerated as VS expected. It was still very much usable, and the minor demon that unwillingly inhabited the red raiment was not strong enough to rebel against the likes of the Dark Apostle. The same applied to the armaments. Both the Tarragon Plasma Spear and the Murder Knife had gone through a round of demon casting. The Tarragon Plasma Spear's tip had inexplicably lengthened in size. Spikes also jutted out along the shaft, which might make it a little more complicated to wield, but the fact that they were able to produce a weaker version of a plasma edge made them deadly to an unwary opponent. The plasma edge burned hotter and brighter despite its lengthening. Just as with the Flame Lord raiment, the Tarragon Plasma Spear was able to absorb more fire energy and thereby raise its output in so many different ways. This was a weapon that was capable of burning its targets with 2 different fires. How it would fare against the Unshakable King remained to be seen, but the human phase lord in question's expression seemed to grow a little more dour after catching sight of the demonized equipment. The final addition to the arsenal was the Murder Knife. This was in fact the only knife that VS designed. It was meant to be used by him during all 4 duels, so he made sure that it remained focused and effective when used correctly. Although the Wicked Knife did not look like a big deal in comparison to the Tarragon Plasma Spear, much of its potency was hidden in plain sight by design. Even its demon-casted form somehow maintained its subtle side even as its edge grew more menacing. The Dark Apostle began to equip his raiment. This was a partially automated process, so he did not encounter too many problems even if the different parts of his armor were not as obedient as they should. "Behave," VS commanded through Blinky's body. Soon enough the Dark Apostle looked like a true warrior this time. When he stepped forward again, the difference in equipment was incredibly stark. The Challenger looked like a much more ideal embodiment of what the Ascended Giants strove for. His menacing red raiment radiated heat and power. Nobody dared to accuse him of being a pushover. Paired with the Tarragon Plasma Spear held in 2 gauntlet hands, the Dark Apostle looked like a war god who had descended from the heavens in order to show the mortals how war was truly supposed to be waged. "You!" The Dark Apostle pointed the unactivated edge of the Tarragon Plasma Spear straight at the Unshakable King. "You shall have the honor of becoming the first Ascended Giant to die at my hands. Do not even think of squirming away from my challenge. No matter whether you manage to save your life or not, I shall kill you and mount your head on a trophy. I must set an example to all of you who secretly aspire to betray your honor and your oaths just so that you can claim the bounty on my head and present it to the Red Cabal." The Unshakable King did not attempt to defend himself or offer any response. He knew how the game was played and he did not want anything to do with it. He would rather let his martial valor speak for itself. As the other 3 Ascended Giants began to retreat from the center of the dueling ground, the 2 duelists continued to stand on opposite ends of the metal plaza. The Unshakable King's raiment should have looked fairly impressive if VS hadn't stolen the show with his darms. Even so, his armor was still thick and reliable enough to withstand all sorts of attacks. He held his 2 impact hammers in a steady grip. Nothing about his stance betrayed any sense of frustration or rage. The Unshakable King behaved as if everything around him was temporal and inconsequential. He was the only solid rock in a temperamental river. To him, it was a given that he would punish the Dark Apostle's impertinent behavior. There was no reason for him to wind himself up when beating down the arrogant mech designer provided much greater satisfaction than any verbal response. The tension grew in the air as both sides readied to commence the duel. A single bot flew in from afar and stopped at the exact center. The bot projected a large countdown. 10. "You know I respect you, Mr. Unshakable King." 9. "You managed to climb your way up to become the strategos of the UR Titan Phalanx." 8. "This is an unexpected accomplishment given your congenital deficiency." 7. "Clearly the Oscillating Fist appointed you for a reason." 6. "I think I know why you don't bother to say anything in response." 5. "You have dedicated your lips for a different purpose than speaking. For, since the bottom half of your body has proven to be inadequate, you can only compensate with the upper side of your body." 3. "How many times have you bent the knee to the Oscillating Fist and greeted him with your mouth?" 2. 100 times? 1,000 times? It must be a great number, for I can see no reason why you are allowed to keep your position when you are so lacking in spine courage in spine. 1. "Before this duel comes to the end, the last object your mouth shall wrap around will be the shaft of my plasma spear. Start." The Unshakable King unexpectedly exploded into action at this time. "Die, you cretin. Thank you for reading my work. If you wish to support the Mech Touch, please vote with your golden tickets. Purchase privilege for the Mech Touch. Read a varying amount of chapters ahead of regular readers, while enjoying a 99% discount on unlocking new chapters. Join the Mech Touch's unofficial Discord server. https://discord.gg/apb5kcu Chapter 71-72. Impact Damage. Chapter 71-72. Impact Damage. The Dark Apostle had done the impossible. He had shook the unshakable king. This should have been impossible. The unshakable king embraced his new name in every way possible. He had tried his best to become both a physical and mental bulwark. He was supposed to become the most solid backbone of the Ascended Giants, the leader who could endure every horror the Red Ocean could throw at them and remain completely unaffected in response. The man's background led up to this evolution. From starting out as an ordinary foot soldier to discharging and becoming a law enforcement officer, the man formerly known as Kierzan Hoslin followed a different trajectory than most of his fellow Ascended Giants. He had spent the most formative years of his life working to police the rowdy and heavily urbanized capital planet of his home state. It was there that he became exposed to the hidden depth of human nature. Kierzan Hoslin came into contact with the most degenerate and rotten humans. From gang enforcers with the blood of innocence on their hands to deranged nihilists who thought that life was futile enough to go on a murder spree, his understanding of humans had sunk to the bottom. He also became exposed to the corruption and sin that took place in the gleaming halls of power. He learned of the indifference of bureaucrats and politicians who may talk a nice game but actually did precious little to serve their constituents. Though Kierzan Hoslin still tried his best to cling to his duty, as he had been taught, when he served in a military organization, the complexities and ambiguities of law enforcement in a flawed society gradually filled him with pessimism. In the end, he gave up on humans at this point. He declared his fight to maintain the law and uphold order to be an exercise in futility and surrendered his badge. It was at this point that self-interest began to trump duty in his mind. He chose to enter the private sector, working first as a bodyguard to rich and vain clients who wanted to have a strong body between themselves and anyone who wished them ill. These gigs paid much better, especially when Mr. Hoslin was able to leverage his prior experience and qualifications for better pay and conditions. A part of him even believed that he should have entered the private sector much sooner. Whatever the case, he earned so much that he eventually started his own security company. With his understanding of the people who served his previous employers, it was easy for him to connect to younger soldiers and law enforcement. Hoslin had met with many different people over his career, and he learned what made the tick. That enabled him to succeed in recruiting more qualified employees, those that possessed records that looked good when skimmed over and could command better rates. Yet even as his business was doing better and better, he still couldn't dig himself out of the hole he ended up in. Once he had recognized and gotten caught in the darkness of the human race's heart, he found himself bereft of any meaningful hope and joy in his life. There was only so much that money could fill this gaping void. He emigrated to the Red Ocean in a desperate search for a light to dispel the darkness. Though it had taken a few twists and turns, he had finally found what he was looking for after becoming a part of the Phase Lord Department. He could finally distance himself from his dirty human roots and assume the identity of an Ascended Giant, a new and pure race that had yet to be stained with the sins and ugliness of humanity. Much like the other Ascended Giants, the unshakable king despised the phrase human Phase Lord. It was too mundane. The very act of attaching the word human to his new race was an affront to his sensibilities. He refused to allow the filth of the human race to defile his new divinity. He also became offended by his progenitor's foul words. The strategos of the UR Titan Phalanx had encountered many foul-mouthed humans over the course of his mortal career, but the fact that the first Ascended Giant not only refused to distance himself from the human race but actively embraced their filth and degeneracy completely violated his bottom line. V.S. Larkin's son, or the Dark Apostle, had to be killed. Not because the mech designer childishly questioned his manhood, but because he defiled the ascending giant race with his human flaws. Seriously, the unshakable king was not the fastest of Phase Lords, but his speed upon bursting into movement still caught the Dark Apostle by surprise. The Dark Apostle did not ignite the plasma blade yet, preferring to rely on the shaft of his polearm to meet the incoming attack. As two powerful impact hammers swung straight into the red-clad Phase Lord's direction, the Dark Apostle put his new skills to good use. He evaded one of the hammers entirely, which was still possible due to the good range of motion of his mutated Flame Lord raiment. The Dark Apostle was even able to force the minor demon locked into the raiment to lend a hand by activating an impulse booster embedded in the torso that gave his true body a small but helpful push to the side. This movement not only helped him evade one hammer but also granted him a bit more force to redirect another hammer. In the end, the second hammer veered off just enough to skid off the surface of the Dark Apostle's spatial barrier. Though the energy barrier still took a mean hit, the damage was mostly undone. At this point, they began to separate again, but neither side had any intentions of backing off. They circled each other, displaying both speed and power as they began a rapid exchange of blows. Filth! The unshakable king no longer acted pretentious and masked his rage anymore. I am ashamed that you are the progenitor of our race. You do not deserve this honor. I shall cleanse the stain that you have passed on to us by slaying you myself. The ascending giant fought as furiously as his words. His twin impact hammers constantly sought to land on his adversary's spatial barrier, seeking to shatter it through concussive force. As much as the Dark Apostle attempted to redirect or evade the frustratingly fast hammers, it was difficult for him to defend against two weapons at the same time. The Unshakable King may not be the best dual wielder in the Red Ocean, but he was still far more skilled than ordinary soldiers. The Dark Apostle had to wring out the most out of the weapon skills he had learned to fend off these strikes, but the impact technology incorporated into the hammers made that so much more difficult. A powerful but silent concussive blast occurred just as one of the flat hammer faces struck the side of the Tarragon plasma spear's shaft. The force was so powerful that the pole arm threatened to get wrenched out of the Dark Apostle's armored grip. If not for greater strength and mass bestowed by the lesser Marigal organ, and the mutated spikes giving the Dark Apostle an unexpected source of leverage, the Unshakable King may have succeeded in shaking the plasma weapon out of red-clad human-phased giant's hands. As it was, the effort to maintain hold over the weapon was so great that it left the Dark Apostle open to a follow-up attack from the other impact hammer. Boom! A huge concussive blow took place as the impact hammer struck directly at the Dark Apostle's spatial barrier. The blow was so much that the dust, dirt, and ice crystals of Jotunheim exploded in every direction, causing optical sensors to become obscured for a short period of time. The two giants quickly rocketed out of it as they continued to clash against each other. The Unshakable King had firmly taken the initiative and sought to overwhelm the Dark Apostle with an unending tide of empowered hammer blows. His armored true body fought against the bulk of his heavy armor. Phase water organs strengthened his muscles and made him move faster than he should. It was all the Dark Apostle could do to fend off most incoming blows. He had yet to light up the plasma blade, knowing that it was not a good idea to allow its relatively fragile head to get struck by the impact hammer. Despite suffering a few more powerful blows to his spatial barrier, the Dark Apostle did not appear desperate to reverse the situation. He even had enough concentration left to taunt his Phase Lord adversary. "Heh, so much for the vaunted Unshakable King. You are as honest and sincere as a Puelmer. To think it would take so little to break your composure. How do the UR Titans regard their leader now that they have seen you in their state? They must have assumed they completely misjudged you. To think that their supposed unflappable leader has hidden so much rage and shame." The Unshakable King let loose a cry of fury and dramatically accelerated for a moment. This was a highly uncharacteristic move that he had never shown before. It was probably a trump card that he had held in reserve to defeat the oscillating fist or fend off a challenger who assumed that he was as slow as a turtle. Instead of saving this capability for a more opportune moment, the Ascended Giant chose to tap into its power early for the purpose of ending the progenitor's life as quickly as possible. Though the UR Titan leader's decision was reckless, he had timed it exquisitely. The Dark Apostle was in the middle of recovering his chance from the latest exchange of blows, and could not stop the Unshakable King from landing both of his impact hammers against his spatial barrier. Much more particles threw up into the air as the simultaneous collision of two impact hammers produced a much more blow than expected. The twin concussive blasts somehow resonated with each other, causing them to amplify each other and inflict a much stronger combined impact that significantly weakened the Dark Apostle's spatial barrier. By now it had probably reached half strength, which was bad because the Unshakable King's defenses had barely suffered any strain since the start of the duel. Yet strangely enough, neither VS in possession of Blinky's manifestation nor the Dark Apostle seemed all that alarmed. They studied their adversary with great attention and scrutinized him in different ways. The more they clashed, the more the split personality gained insight into what made the Unshakable King tick. VS meanwhile paid great attention to the Unshakable King's gear. He was a mech designer, so he understood far more than these ignorant human phase lords how their technology worked. He could even deduce the overall thought process behind every significant design choice. The powerful twin impact attack had clearly overstrained the Unshakable King. Though he clearly wanted to press on the offensive, he deemed it better for him to pause and allow his abused body and phase water organs a small period of recovery. No matter what, the Unshakable King was still a defensive specialist. Offense was not his forte, though he had clearly proven his competence in this aspect. "You know nothing, Larkin son," the Unshakable King spat back. "The UR Titans stand behind me, especially once I have claimed your head from your soon-to-be-ruined body. Already your spatial barrier is about to go into shambles. Your edgy excuse of arraignment will follow suit soon enough. By ending your life, the Ascended Giant shall no longer be kept in bondage by your existence. Red humanity shall no longer lay claim to our race. Instead, we shall join our divine brothers in arms across the border and begin our reign as gods in earnest. No mortal sin or weakness shall taint us evermore. For this I shall gladly have your blood in my hands. Thank you for reading my work. If you wish to support the Mech Touch, please vote with your golden tickets. Purchase privilege for the Mech Touch. Read a varying amount of chapters ahead of regular readers, while enjoying a 99% discount on unlocking new chapters. Join the Mech Touch's unofficial Discord server. https://discord.com GG/APB5KCU. Chapter 71, 73, 71, 73. Subtle Influence. Though the Ascended Giant needed to rest his overstrained body, he only needed a short time to allow his unnaturally strong constitution return to a more tolerable state. The unshakable king wasted no further time and began to charge forward intent on finishing the job. Yet just as he was halfway to closing the distance, an accident occurred. A handful of the servos on his legs unexpectedly malfunctioned, causing the unshakable king's rhythm to become interrupted. Though he could still power through this unexpected event, the momentary break in momentum caused him to halt. "What did you do, foul human?" Blinky grinned like a cat that got the canary. "I did nothing. You are solely responsible for your own misuse of your equipment. Did you ever bother to read the manual of your raiment? This thing was never designed to facilitate such violent motions. The developers of your raiment built it like a tank with the expectation that you would fight like one. Your attempt to mimic a charging beast has clearly exceeded the tolerances of your armor, causing it to wear down at an accelerated rate, especially when you burst into motion with extreme force." The unshakable king had been so adamant about keeping his new capabilities secret that he had neglected to test them thoroughly enough. This clearly proved the Ascended Giants had become so authoritarian that they had neglected the sensible advice and recommendations of their staff officers. Just because the Ascended Giants assumed they were gods did not mean they were infallible. They could still be wrong because they clearly did not possess a lot of expertise in many fields, most notably a technical understanding of their raiments. Servos and motors were not necessary in most light raiments, as the physical prowess of an Ascended Giant was more than sufficient to maneuver with so much mass attached to their bodies. The same could not be said for the kind of heavy raiment that clad the unshakable king's form. While it was outdated, it was truly a good example of robust engineering. Its developers had configured it with the expectation that the unshakable king would carry forth the UR Titan tradition of being defensive bulwarks. Enhancing mobility was therefore an afterthought, but in order to make sure that the Phase Lord could carry all of his bulk around without growing too sluggish, the raiment still contained a number of servos, just like heavy combat armor. Of course, it could still be argued whether these servos were necessary, considering that Phase Lords were still considerably stronger, even accounting for their exaggerated sizes. Blinky continued to grin as VS criticized the meathead even further. "We allowed you to wail on us not just because you were doing a good job at abusing your own raiment, but also so we could take the measure of you. We know how fast you can move. We know how much force you can put behind your weapon swings. I have already calculated the force amplification of your impact hammer mechanisms. I know how this tech works. I understand its strengths, as well as its weaknesses." The unshakable king did not move. The more he listened, the more he frowned. There was a part of him that urged him to disregard the alarms transmitted by his raiment and continue to charge forward. A true ascending giant did not need to rely on armor in order to defeat his opponents. He would purge his heavy combat armor if that would help him close the distance faster. Yet just as this insane idea could take root, the unshakable king's discipline reasserted itself and squashed it into pieces. This was not a sound strategy. To discard the enormous defensive advantage of his raiment was a completely uncharacteristic notion. He would never come up with such an idea during normal times. It was at this point that the unshakable king realized that something greater was amiss. When he forced himself to reflect on his recent words and actions, he realized that he had comported himself in a completely different manner than he should. The strategos broke his own rules and answered too readily to his adversaries' provocations. Even now, the unshakable kings had to resist several tempting but ultimately stupid ideas to go on the attack. One of them even called for throwing one of his hammers at the Dark Apostle. "You dishonorable cur." The unshakable king pinned his opponent with an accusing stare. "You did this to me. There is something about your presence that is quietly forcing me to lower myself to your level. What foul human sorcery have you cast on me that is responsible for clouding my judgment? Do you think I would be stupid enough to give you the answer?" Blinky huffed and swished his black-tipped tail. "We did nothing aside from exposing your true self that is hidden behind your stoic mask. If you were truly as noble and exemplary as your public persona suggested, then you would have shown such an ugly face to your fellow Ascended Giants." Only VS and the Dark Apostle knew that the reason why the unshakable king behaved with fewer scruples and inhibitions than before was due to the corrupting orb. VS had not wasted the recent golden lottery ticket prize. He had thought about how he could put it to good use in the upcoming duels. There was no time to develop anything fancy, so he simply decided to create a hidden slot inside all of the raiments that just happened to accommodate the new artifact. By surrounding it with darkness hypers and channeling more darkness energy into it, the corrupting orb strengthened its capacity to corrupt the minds and spirits of anyone that came in close proximity. VS and the Dark Apostle were virtually immune to the orb's insidious influence, but the same could not be said for others. The unshakable king's mentality, discipline, and Phase Lord endowments may have granted him much more resistance than most, but one of the dangerous aspects about the corrupting orb was that it exploited any chink in the armor. Even the greatest of heroes possessed one weakness or another. The corrupting orb played in on that, ignoring what others were good at in favor of preying on their weakness. Although the unshakable king was not an ordinary figure, his mind and spirit were still relatively weak compared to his undaunted true body. The close proximity of the earlier confrontations combined with the unshakable king's existing mental flaws meant that the corrupting orb only needed to induce a few small pushes here and there to induce a significant change in the human phase lord's behavioral pattern. Although it was a pity that the unshakable king caught on to his own abnormalities so soon, VS was still happy at the results. The unshakable king's unambiguous words exposed his treasonous thoughts and ideas to both enemies and allies. There could be no mistaking his positioning, and VS had every right to defeat and kill this traitor to the human race. There was a difference between killing a beloved hero and killing a traitor that would have led them to damnation. The Dark Apostle finally activated the plasma edge of his weapon. The Tarragon plasma spear finally assumed its proper form. The minor demon locked inside the Dharm had been waiting long enough for this moment. It had become far too frustrated at all of the heavy defensive actions. That was not all. The Dark Apostle's flame lord raiment entered into a second phase of readiness. Heat radiated from different ports, and most notably the backpack module, as the large reactor had become fully active. The Dark Apostle already felt a lot of heat wrapped around his physique. The insulation of his raiment was rather poor due to lack of time and capacity, so the Phase Lord had little choice but to allow his enormous true body to act as a makeshift heatsink. The flood of fire energy converging from the surrounding environment completely overshadowed the other elements. This included darkness energy, which actively sought to shy away from all of the hot and scorching fire energy. All of this fueled the Dharms even further. Their energy levels had become notably higher. The flight system mounted in the rear even spread out and produced flaming wings. The unshakable king observed all of this. His raiment tried to analyze what was going on and make sense of it, but it was unable to come up with any coherent answers. Now that he had recognized his own faults, the UR Titan leader resolutely slipped back to his old ways. He did not choose to stand his ground, but instead lifted off and floated in the air. "I see you have decided to get serious now, Larkin's son. Come join me in orbit. Let us end this fight in space. That is the true arena of our kind." The more pragmatic reason for insisting on fighting in space was that the unshakable king did not have to strain his raiment that much when fighting in space. His flight system, as opposed to his legs, were responsible for his mobility. There was less chance of equipment failure if he relied on the former to move around. It was already designed with a lot of rigorous activities in mind. The Dark Apostle did not refuse this invitation. He could have charged and forced the unshakable king back onto the ground again, but he too preferred to fight in space whenever possible. It took a bit of time for both of them to ascend to an acceptable height. The unshakable king finally stopped and maintained orbit while adopting a full defensive posture. He even activated his Tarse organ to affix his body into the same relative coordinates and make him fully live out his name for becoming unshakable. The unshakable king did not mount any offensive actions. He simply hovered in place and silently invited for the Dark Apostle to go on the offense. The unshakable king seeks to exhaust us to death. His earlier displays of martial valor should have earned him a hefty amount of points. He can afford to stall us for the remainder of the duel. It is not honorable, but it was a much more effective approach. We must go on the offensive as we originally planned. The human phase lord accurately judged. Forget about other goals or side objectives. We must solely set our sights on the greatest threat. As the corruption orb took a backseat due to concentrating so much fire energy, the Tarragon Flame Spear and the Flame Lord Raiment both sought to have a taste of Phase Lord blood. The Dark Apostle became determined to oblige them. He called upon their power and charged forth like a comet soaring through a star system. As the attacking party came close to the unshakable king, the Dark Apostle suddenly experienced discomfort and involuntary slowdowns as changes in gravity along with strange illusions was doing its best to distract him from his mission. This was the lesser Tarse organ at work. It served as an excellent way to prevent starships from escaping the star system and to secure high-risk adversaries. Though the Dark Apostle already anticipated a move like this, he still grew clumsy despite all of the psychological preparation. Yet despite his lack of experience and the newness of his newly acquired fighting skills, the Dark Apostle pushed through all of these hindrances and thrust his plasma spear forward just as twin hammers either sought to demolish the plasma weapon or successfully blast it out of its current owner's grip. As if that would work. Short of striking the unshakable king's bulky form, an energy construct grew from the tip of the spear and struck the Phase Lord's spatial barrier. The briefly empowered Tarragon plasma spear burned with unnatural hotness. Its tip had lengthened and was able to inflict damage considerably easier with the help of the extra reach. The spatial barrier of the unshakable king began to suffer intense blows. Though the human Phase Lord tried his best to compensate, his twin impact hammers felt like a burden and his maneuverability in space was not too great. Chapter 71-74 Impact Hammers. The unshakable king dominated the initial engagement. In his fury and his loss of control, he exposed much of his strength and showed off how fearsome of a phase lord he had truly become. His strength was indeed formidable. His physical strength surpassed that of normal phase lords due to relying on several phase water organs. His ability to boost his movement speed was also quite respectable. His impact hammers did a great job of channeling his strength and amplifying his blows. On top of that, he was also able to anchor himself in space and turn the surroundings into a spatial quagmire, making it a lot more difficult for attackers to maneuver around and create useful openings. Now that the unshakable king had come to his senses, he truly became a tough nut to crack. His impact hammers may have a relatively short reach, but they could lash out at VS at any time when the ascending giant abruptly abandoned his space anchoring and unexpectedly lunged forward. The threat of getting whacked at any time prevented the Dark Apostle from treating his adversary as a punching bag. The unshakable king was not a harmless wall. It was a hedgehog. It was a fortress with teeth. Yet the Dark Apostle did not fight as feebly as before. VS and the Dark Apostle had completed their initial observations of their foe. They had taken the measure of the unshakable king and concluded that it was well within their capability to defeat the Strategos. Of course, this was just an initial evaluation. There was no way the leader of the UR Titan phalanx possessed so little depth. He most definitely kept a few trump cards in reserve, but fewer than ideal due to his earlier impulses. Then again, VS and the Dark Apostle did the same. They still kept a few secret weapons in reserve as the right time had not yet come. All that mattered now was that the pair needed to regain the lead by making short work of their adversary's vaunted defenses. The difference in strength between you and him is smaller than expected. VS privately communicated to his phase lord side. The lesser Marigal organ developed by the RC is not anything special, but it has given us a crucial jump in physical prowess. While the unshakable king can still overpower us with the help of other strength-boosting phase water organs, they are more exhausting and temperamental in use. That sounds nice, but I am still going to suffer if I get hit. Then make good use of the reach of your plasma spear. It is admittedly not as long as we wish, but it still gives you a pronounced advantage. Call upon the power of your Dharms. Draw upon the power of the fire element. The Tarragon Plasma Spear and the Flame Lord Raiment were originally designed to work with each other. You have yet to unlock their full potential. You can't just use the hardware. You also need to draw upon the power of the minor demons themselves. The Dark Apostle frowned. I have learned the same theory and techniques as you, so you should know that I can only do that with one Dharm at a time. Besides, they are so hungry that they will compete much harder to absorb the surrounding fire energy. Use your brain a little more. You are not alone. I have designed the Flame Lord Raiment for situations just like this where I want to control its more advanced technological functions. The demon casting process should have preserved most of them. I will be taking root in your armor. Do not be surprised if it does stuff without your explicit command. While I am there, make sure you execute your new demonic possession spearmanship techniques that I have reshaped to draw upon the fire element. Blinky is fully prepared to let you draw as much fire-attributed energy from the Blinkyverse as possible. Don't worry about consumption. The duels won't last long enough for any critical imbalances to occur. Both of them had to work together in order to get the most out of their gear. As Blinky began to inhabit the Flame Lord Raiment, it soon began to light up even more. The equipment lit up even further. A fire hyper-energy shield came online that closely followed the contours of the active spatial barrier. Aside from that, the space suppressor became more powerful, while specialized sensor systems paid a lot more attention to specific phenomena. Fire energy also began to radiate from the raiment. Blinky tried to supply as much fire energy to his gear as he could manage. This caused the armor to show faint illusions of flames, making it seem as if the entire Phase Lord had become a living inferno. The Dark Apostle worked hard to draw out even more fire energy in order to power up the Tarragon Plasma Spear. The strong infusion of fire energy caused the Dharm's plasma tip to grow, longer, thicker, and more hotter than ever. The massive energy boost clearly made the unshakable king more concerned. The enemy Phase Lord braced himself even harder in space with the expectation that he would have to fend off a very powerful attack. Ready? Ready. The two sounded like harmonious teammates. In the face of a common enemy, their own animosity towards each other had been reduced to a minimum. Both personalities understood the importance of winning this duel with as little consumption as possible. Go. Be patient and sap his spatial barrier. Target his impact hammers whenever possible. Attack the shaft of the sides of their hammerheads. Do not attack their flat faces. The Dark Apostle kept this advice in mind as he went on the attack. The closer he came, the more his form blazed with the power of fire and determination. Like a phoenix swooping in for the kill, the flaming ascended giant attempted to inflict a heavy blow with his first charge. When he almost reached his target, the Dark Apostle only became somewhat disoriented due to the change in environment. One of the unshakable king's phase water organs made it a lot harder to navigate in his vicinity. However, the Dark Apostle was able to push through regardless. As soon as he came close enough, he activated one of the new modified techniques. More fire energy than ever surged from the Blinkyverse and surged right into the Tarragon Plasma Spear. The plasma edge abruptly heated up a lot more, causing its damage potential to soar, if only momentarily, with fire energy being expended at such a prodigious rate that the red-clad Phase Lord looked like a blazing comet. The fire-charged plasma spear struck the unshakable king's spatial barrier and erupted in flaming fury. The damage of this basic power move was astonishing. The Dharm, combined with all of the other factors, had drastically increased the Dark Apostle's ability to inflict damage. Admirably, the unshakable king flinched but did not lose his concentration. Even as the Dark Apostle attempted to fly away, the unshakable king unexpectedly altered the expression of his tarse organ. This momentarily generated a fairly strong spatial ripple that caused the Dark Apostle's forward progress to become momentarily interrupted. Though this problem disappeared shortly after it appeared, it still caused the challenger's departure to be delayed just long enough for the unshakable king to lunge forward and launch a devastating counterattack with his twin impact hammers. Yet, before the powerful hammers could connect and almost blow away the Dark Apostle's spatial barrier, the flight system, as well as a handful of boosters, were hurriedly activated on VS command. The rapid response pushed the Dark Apostle out of the way just enough to evade the devastating blows. Missed. The Dark Apostle spun around again. The fire energy wafting from his increasingly hotter form made him look alive and full of passion. He looked far more valiantly than his current foe due to moving around. As the flaming Phase Lord turned around to commit to another charge, the leader of the UR Titan Phalanx responded not with his twin hammers but with his armored foot. As the unshakable king stomped the fabric of space, the latter shook as invisible space quakes spread from the epicenter. The Dark Apostle got swept by these powerful spatial ripples. These ripples were serious business as his alter ego struggled to maintain his balance and positioning in space when the entire fabric of space started to curl up for whatever reason. It took significantly more effort for the Red Phase Lord to recover his stance and wit. This came not a moment too soon, because the unshakable king had made another short-range dash that would put him right on top of the Dark Apostle. However, just before the unshakable king could unleash his twin revenge strike, the Flame Lord armor released a seemingly uncontrolled blast of fire energy, as well as reactor in every direction. The entire surroundings momentarily heated up. The unshakable king lacked the means to look past the particle cloud, so when she headed straight into the mist field, the Dark Apostle had already made a getaway. Where? Behind. The unspeakable king rapidly tried to turn around to meet the incoming attack, but his own bulk and lack of grace hindered his movements. By the time he was more than halfway through completing his rotation, the Tarragon Plasma Spear did not strike the unspeakable king's spatial barrier as expected, but changed course last second in order to land a serious strike on the hammer side. Alloys melted while other parts started to exhibit signs of fracturing. The plasma spear ultimately inflicted moderate damage to the impact hammer, though the progress was not yet obvious. This is good. The impact hammer is still working, but if you whack it on this same side for a few more times, something eventually has to break. The design of the impact hammers makes it clear that it is designed to resist physical damage absurdly well, but it does not possess the same durability when it comes to blocking energy attacks. The unshakable king discovered the concerning condition of his own weapon. None of his adversaries had ever targeted his weapon specifically with the intent of disabling it first. Then again, the unshakable king was sure that his impact hammers were resistant against plasma damage. He specifically made this request when he commissioned their development. This is impossible. Anything is possible. My tech happens to be better than yours. This isn't your grandma's plasma weapon. You craven mech designer. Fight me, not my weapon. Ha, why would I when you are dangling them so confidently before my eyes? From the moment the unshakable king realized that the mechanisms of his impact hammer was vulnerable to the plasma spear, he showed a lot more restraint than before. He absolutely did not want his weapons to get ruined too soon, so he stopped his attacks when he judged that there was a risk that they would get smacked by a fire-charged plasma weapon on the side. This caused him to become less threatening, enabling the Dark Apostle to drain his spatial barrier with less risk than before. After a number of attack passes, the unshakable king's first layer of defense was on the verge of failing. It took a fair bit of time, because the enemy Phase Lord activated his Raymond's Azure Energy Shield on an intermittent basis to delay this breakpoint. Though the unshakable king's effort failed to save his spatial barrier from deteriorating so much, he at least managed to buy a bit more time. To a defensive expert like him, trying to run out the clock and win the duel on points was a familiar strategy to him. He was not in a hurry. What a hard energy shell. How many phase water organs are reinforcing your spatial barrier? The unshakable king did not respond with words, but made an unexpected move by lifting his foot and crashing it down, causing space to ripple just as violently as before. While the Dark Apostle anticipated this move and already started to back off and go on the defensive, the ripples were stronger than last time, causing him to remain off balance for a moment longer. If that was not enough, the unshakable king made another surprising move. He spread his arms and swung them into each other, causing the two impact hammers to collide against each other in their faces. A powerful spatial shockwave burst forth and destabilized the space around the Dark Apostle. Though the event only lasted for a short amount of time, this was enough for the unshakable king to take advantage of certain spatial characteristics and blink right next to the Dark Apostle. What? Meet your punishment, you profane worm. Chapter 71-75 Equipment Reliance. VS underestimated the capabilities of the impact hammers. He also underestimated the unshakable king's mobility. Although he only teleported a short distance away, he happened to do so during a moment where the surrounding space was still destabilized by his own actions. The idea was genius now that VS thought about it a little further. There were two ways to inhibit spatial phenomena. The first was to strengthen the fabric of space. The harder it was to change it to facilitate a certain ability or action, the less capable a phase lord was able to do anything useful. The effects of their manipulation would either be lessened or suppressed entirely. Another way to stop phase lords from casting their weird space magic was to destabilize the fabric of space. Making it looser should normally facilitate spatial manipulation, but causing it to go into chaos made it almost impossible to perform any structured techniques. Almost. In a situation where the unshakable king was able to generate a highly focused, uniform, and consistent destabilizing effect, it was theoretically possible for him to perform a simple spatial ability. A short-ranged instant teleportation ability barely fell within this scope. The initial attempts would definitely fail. The unshakable king likely also needed the support of an entire staff whose job was to collect readings, analyze the data, and advise the ascending giant on how to thread the needle through all of the destabilized space. Through persistent practice, the unshakable king may eventually succeed in his endeavor. Where other human phase lords found themselves stuck, disoriented, and unable to activate most of their spatial abilities, the unshakable king was able to power through his own disorder and resist the discomfort of ending up in the middle of an unstable area. You are unworthy to lead the ascended giants. Your over-reliance on gear has made you soft. The unshakable king began to wail at the Dark Apostle's spatial barrier with his impact hammer. The bad news was that the challenger was completely out of position and unable to fend off the attacks right away. The good news was that the mechanisms responsible for producing powerful concussive forces endured excessive strain and couldn't be activated for the time being. That being said, the unshakable king still possessed plenty of power on his own. Combined with his ability to anchor himself in space for greater leverage, he was able to strike at the spatial barrier with so much power that it was already on the verge of breaking. Though the Dark Apostle initially tried to put distance between himself and his teleported opponent, the spatial disruptions were much greater and hindered his forward progress just enough to enable the unshakable king to stick to him like a barnacle. He proceeded to use his acquired fighting skills to block or redirect the hammer blows. There was no opportunity for him to use the plasma tip to launch any counterattacks because the unshakable king had entered into his full offensive rhythm. His hammers struck like galloping legs. While their force was not the greatest, the repeated strikes took an awful toll on the spatial barrier. Soon it cracked and disintegrated as the Dark Apostle was no longer able to retain his first line of protection. You are just as weak as your barrier. Now stay in place so that I can pulverize your entire body aside from your head. The Dark Apostle was not about to let that happen. Though his spatial barrier was gone, it had lasted long enough for him and his other self to prepare a so-called power move. Blinky had been saturating the surrounding with as much fire energy as he could spill out of his imaginary universe. He had also been channeling as much fire energy into the Flame Lord Raiment in preparation for a fierce counterattack. After the preparation period had passed, VS immediately issued a command. Break plasma containment. At the same time, the Dark Apostle had drawn his spear back and held it in a very close grip by holding it right behind its rapidly heating plasma tip. The beleaguered phase lord aimed the tip right at his adversary while doing his best to activate an improvised technique. Dragon's Breath. The Darm's plasma edge suddenly lost definition. The plasma that was normally supposed to be tightly contained had now come loose. A stream of thin but extremely deadly plasma struck the unshakable king's spatial barrier without any issue. The range was so short that it was impossible for the Dark Apostle to miss. The heat and brightness released by the stream of plasma was so bright that the enemy phase lord was unable to persist in his attack. The fire energy channeled into the Tarragon plasma spear and floating in the environment significantly amplified the power of this dangerous torrent, causing it to inflict even more damage to the unshakable king's defenses. Unfortunately, the Tarragon plasma spear was not primarily designed to function as a ranged weapon. It endured great strain to maintain this output, but once it neared its limit, the Dark Apostle was forced to cut off the plasma stream lest it melt through the internals of his main weapon entirely. It had done enough. Not only had the emergency move interrupted the unshakable king's offensive, his spatial barrier had depleted rapidly during this sequence. It should not take too many strikes with the plasma spear to collapse it entirely, though the Dark Apostle knew he had to give the weapon enough time to cool down. He therefore chose to back off and let his deactivated weapon rest for a short amount of time. Blinky nodded in approval. Be careful of another sneak attack. I do not know how often the unshakable king can pull off his earlier combo, but the act of generating a field of destabilized space in front of him must definitely be hard on his impact hammers. In fact, I am not even sure whether they can recover their original concussive enhancement effect. Although the unshakable king looked a little affected by the earlier move, he quickly began to sneer as he held his hammers at the ready. Again, you think you can save yourself with your technology. True strength comes from our bodies, not these toys of yours. I can say the same for you. The Dark Apostle huffed. Those impact hammers of yours caught us off guard, but that will not happen a second time. Besides, your hammers have become a lot more boring now that they don't produce extra force anymore. What is wrong? Have they failed to withstand the violence of your own moves? I do not need any tech to finish you off. Now that your spatial barrier is gone, there is nothing that can stop my hammers from bludgeoning you into pieces. As the unshakable king soared forward, the Dark Apostle flew backwards. No matter what, the Dark Apostle still possessed superior mobility. The enemy Phase Lord quickly recalled the futility of going on the offensives, and stopped in place. He shook his head as if he discovered that he let his emotions overrule his good sense yet another time. I do not need to come to you. It is you that needs to come to me. The unshakable king smirked. If you do not hurry, then the clock will run out sooner or later. I shall definitely be able to win on points, thereby denying you of a victory. He was right. There were multiple reasons why the Dark Apostle had to go on the offensive. The challenger did not charge forward straight away. He instead waited to give his weapon a little more time to recover. Blinky had already dove into the Dharm in order to inspect its internals and facilitate its recovery through means that the human Phase Lord did not understand. A lull had formed. The two Phase Lords continued to hover in orbit of Jotunheim. The unshakable king did not mind the pause because his spatial barrier slowly recovered with each passing second. The Dark Apostle needed to make intensive use of his Tarragon plasma spear very soon, so it was important to inspect it and wait for it to recover as much as possible. The two once again fell into a tense discussion. Despite your traitorous words, I think that you are not so different from myself. The unshakable king regained his cool to an extent. He was doing his best to maintain a tight grip on his emotions. You claim you fight for red humanity, but the way you fight is like a mercenary. You fight for greed, not for ideals. You are only getting along with these red humans because they have pressured you with a combination of enticements and threats. The Dark Apostle frowned. How did you know? I used to be one of them. I know how those who possess wealth and the illusion of power operate. To them you are a threat that cannot easily be controlled, a being who has transcended the scope of their pitiful humanity. Instead of worshipping us as the superior beings we are, they reject our divinity and seek to enslave us as they have done with others deemed different from their own race. Humans are one of the most xenophobic races in the Milky Way, as well as the Red Ocean. You will never belong in their society. If they do not look at you with fear, they will look at you with loathing. This caused the Dark Apostle to frown deeper. Though he identified with the unshakable king's description, that did not mean he was willing to embrace the other extreme. Humans fear what they do not understand. We are strange to them, but who knows whether that will remain the same in a couple of centuries. Besides, the opinions of these worms do not interest me that much. I like the identity of an ascended giant, but there is a difference between standing up for your own race and volunteering to become a slave to the Red Cabal. Instead of working towards independence, you are working towards surrendering yourself and your fellow brothers to a band of aliens who have many reasons to hate us for our human heritages. Switching from one slave master to another is a stupid idea. You would not think so if you realize the true corruption that is festering in our society. Red humanity is too far gone. Only the native galactic community can lead us to a newer and better future. We are gods. We have embraced their enlightened ways. As long as we present ourselves to the alien Phase Lords and Phase Whales, they will recognize us as king and agree to add us to their governing council or whatever body that makes all of the decisions. Ha! The Dark Apostle sneered. You are utterly delusional if you think the native aliens cannot see past your human facade. You may hate the mortals all you want, but you have far more in common with them than any alien. Insolent brat. I know what you are doing, Larkin's son. If you want to persuade me that my course is wrong, then convince me with your fists, not your words. The Dark Apostle finally went into action again, seeing that the unshakable king still don't want to move on a whim. The plasma tip lit up and began to release a familiar heat again. The Dharm had survived the earlier emergency move and would stay operational until at least the end of this event. As the Dark Apostle almost came close enough to attack, he veered to the side at the last moment and managed to tag the Unshakable King's faltering spatial barrier by another fraction. Nothing special happened. The Dark Apostle repeated the Hitandran attacks and found that the Unshakable King had practically turned himself into a rock. This was not a guy who would respond to provocations anymore. Chapter 71-76 The Father of Companion Spirits. The Unshakable King painted the illusion of weakness at this time. His attempts to defend his faltering spatial barrier was considerably more feeble than before. VS was not fooled. He urged the Dark Apostle to prioritize caution over recklessness, and this time the alternate personally obeyed without restraint. It appeared more and more clear that the Unshakable King had pushed his weapons and armor beyond their safety levels. His raiment still performed fine more or less, but his impact hammers had taken an awful toll in a short amount of time. The Dark Apostle knew that so long as his adversary's main weapons remained partially disabled, the Unshakable King was unlikely to overcome the spatial suppression and teleport himself or others in close proximity to their designated targets. The question was whether those impact hammers were truly stuck in a disabled state. Not even VS was able to make this determination. "Bring me closer," he instructed. "I need to get a good look at them. Maybe I will pay them a visit. I won't be able to boost you as much as before, so you are on your own for the next few minutes. I do not need you to hold my own against the Unshakable King," the Dark Apostle arrogantly said. "My earlier performance was just a warm-up. Now that I have become used to fighting with these darms, I am sure I can inflict wounds on this guy." He did not intend to make idle boasts. Just after he said that, he boldly began to fight against the Unshakable King. This time the Dark Apostle properly took advantage of his better mobility and the reach of his weapon. He did not take any excessive risks and made sure to strike with his plasma spear lunged as far forward as possible. This put his armored form out of the reach of the impact hammer most of the time. While the Unshakable King made various attempts to shift forward without warning, the Dark Apostle's caution and strategy foiled these attacks. The Unshakable King's stressed spatial barrier only recovered by a small extent. Now the Tarragon Plasma Spear invalidated that recovery and inflicted even further damage onto it, causing it to move closer to total collapse. The Dark Apostle grew more and more eager to see this happen. He couldn't help but fight a little more aggressively in order to hasten this favorable outcome. That did not mean he was unaware that this may be an elaborate trap. He practically expected it to be, given the depth previously shown by the Unshakable King. During these exchanges, Blinky remained absent on the surface. The Star Cat had secretly slipped inside one of the impact hammers. This was very much possible since it was a pure technological product that did not possess any inherent protection against his intrusion. It was not a weapon held by a high-ranking mech with willpower that was strong enough to rebuke an intruding spirit. It was not an artifact that possessed varying degrees of resistance against an unwelcome visitor. It also was not a Dharm that was inhabited by a hostile demon. The lack of protection gave VS the confidence that Blinky could safely take a peek inside the weapon. Trying to understand the impact hammer from the inside was a challenging exercise. VS did not gain access to a clean and organized blueprint. He instead felt as if he was a blind person trying to work out how a device worked by touching its parts with his fingertips. While Blinky was a lot more sophisticated than a physical limb, there was only so much he could do to help VS piece together the blueprint. It took a lot more time than he expected for him to understand the mechanisms that powered the concussive force effect. It was indeed a clever piece of high technology. VS had figured out the basic principles and could even replicate it to a lesser degree with the help of his stolen insights. What he could determine was that the tech was not as robust as it appeared on the outside. The hammer, as well as its internals, had to resist enough shocks with every violent impact. After all, Newton's third law still applied in this situation. The designers did make use of a variety of exotics to mitigate the opposing reaction and dampen the shocks coursing through the impact hammers. They only worked up to an extent, as there was not enough room for more dampening effects. What VS also noticed was that many parts possessed self-repair functionality. The developers of the impact hammer had made a good effort to prolong its lifespan and preserve its most powerful feature. The incorporation of self-healing exotics slowly restored the advanced electronics that were prone to breaking. Although their rate of recovery was slow enough, time had passed for the hammers to return to their full strength. VS could not let that happen. He decided to take action himself. Just as Blinky was about to approach one of the more critical parts, and got ready to ruin it by performing a small spell, another spiritual being suddenly entered the impact hammer, causing it to become a lot more crowded all of a sudden. A shrunken, unarmored, and translucent version of the Unshakable King flew in front of the intruding spiritual cat. "You do not belong here, you human slave. Mro. Figures I would get screwed by my own invention." VS remembered that every ascended giant received their own companion spirit fruit. The human phase lords possessed powerful bodies, but their minds and spiritualities may still be vulnerable to targeted attacks, so they were advised to nurture companion spirits that could fend off such assaults. For your attempts to desecrate my weapon, I sentence you to death. The miniature giant, which sounded ridiculous to say the least, uttered a war cry before charging straight at Blinky with fists rearing to punch. The hostile companion spirit was practically shaped for battle against other spiritual beings. He closed the distance quickly and began to wail onto Blinky's manifestation with blows that were infused with the concepts of force oscillation and space. In other words, the giant attempted to leverage the same concepts mastered by the oscillating fist by deliberately shaping his chi cultivation around them. Though the companion spirit was too young, his superficial understanding of those concepts was still enough to empower him in battle. Blinky, on the other hand, was more of a generalist and a supporter. Though he was still able to block the incoming attacks by conjuring a spiritual shield that was constantly being sustained by the energies pouring out of the Blinkyverse, the miniature giant proved to be surprisingly good at punching. VS was momentarily stunned as he did not expect to be confronted by a hostile spirit. Yet just because he was caught off guard did not mean he was defenseless. The spiritual shield held. Although it was just a simple ability that shouldn't have lasted as long as it should, the difference was that it was constantly being fed by the energies of the Blinkyverse. While the miniature giant was inflicting greater damage than what Blinky was able to recover, the latter's effort was still helpful because it dramatically delayed how long it would take for the spiritual shield to get broken. Blinky had no intention of sitting back and doing nothing. The star cat's purple form began to darken slightly as he opened up his mouth and tried to suck in the miniature giant, or at least the ambient E-energy radiation. The cat had to reduce the amount of E-energy being fed to the spiritual shield in order to free up enough bandwidth to devour ambient E-energy, but the hostile companion spirit found himself in dire straits. The miniature giant felt an attracting force that was attempting to pull him into a dark, unfathomable, and terrible space. The companion spirit instinctively knew that if he got pulled into the mouth of the purple cat, he would never be able to break out by relying on his own force. He no longer cared about protecting the impact hammer and tried to get away. Yet, because he attempted to assault Blinky at such a close distance, the feline companion spirit's devouring force had grown strong enough to slow down his forward progress. Abomination! You are not human. Well duh. I am a cat, silly. You are engaging in cannibalism. PFFF, you are wrong. This form is modeled after a cat while you are modeled after an ascended giant. We are not humans. We are predator and prey. It was a mistake for you to show up to me with your level of power. I am the father of companion spirits. Do you truly think I would have no defense against my own creations? Though the miniature giant was gaining more distance with every passing second, the shining white jewel embedded on his forehead briefly shone brighter. A small but focused beam of Warclaw energy crossed the imaginary space and struck the miniature giant, inflicting a serious wound. How can you be so powerful? VS did not deign to answer this question. Although Blinky had to use a small amount of precious and slow to replenish Warclaw energy, its power was not in doubt. The star cat could have killed the miniature giant if he pumped more Warclaw energy into this attack, but VS wanted to save as much of it as possible for the subsequent duels. There was a large probability that Blinky might need to bail the Dark Apostle out if the latter had put himself into known situations. In any case, the miniature giant's injury not only broke his concentration and caused him to suffer a form of pain that he had never experienced in his short lifespan, but also weakened him just enough that the balance tilted against his favor. His translucent humanoid form was slowly moving closer and closer to Blinky's open maw. The devouring force felt unnatural. It was not only strong but conveyed a strong sense of doom and despair. If the miniature giant was not the companion spirit of a powerful strategos of the UR Titan phalanx, he may have already chosen to give up by this time. Yet it was exactly because he was the partner of a human phase lord that he continued to remain unyielding. The miniature giant began to scream as he felt parts of himself breaking down into a more regular form of E-energy before being sucked straight into the star cat's metaphorical stomach. Blinky did not taste flavors in the conventional sense. E-energy was E-energy, possessed its own characteristics. The companion spirit merely tasted a small measure of the spirituality that ultimately belonged to the unshakable king. At this time his body froze minutely. The ascended giant most definitely felt the injury to his spirituality long enough for him to mistime his defensive response. The plasma spear struck his spatial barrier and finally overloaded it after several minutes of fighting. This was a significant victory for VS because the unshakable king's spatial barrier was notably stronger and more resistant against damage with the help of at least one defensive phase water organ. Now it had turned useless as the unshakable king could only rely on the protection offered by his raiment and his thick physical body to block subsequent attacks. Meanwhile, Blinky kept unraveling the hostile companion spirit in slow motion. A trickle of imprinted E-energy constantly drew away from the miniature giant and passed straight through the star cat's gullet. As this took place, VS began to experience slightly stronger hallucinations of the unshakable king life before he became a human phase lord. The hallucinations remained relatively harmless for the time being, but he could easily guess that the chances of suffering a backlash was much greater if Blinky attempted to absorb a much more powerful being. Chapter 71-77 Spirit Wound. Chapter 71-77 Spirit Wound. The duel between the Dark Apostle and the Unshakable King had entered a new and much more intensive phase. Two confrontations took place at the same time. On the surface, the Dark Apostle finally made proper use of his advantages and successfully managed to whittle down the Unshakable King's spatial barrier without incurring any serious injuries to his exposed true body. Yet what happened out of sight of the vast majority of observers was the secret competition between companion spirits. Blinky's special traits and abilities happened to turn him into a nemesis towards many energy-based life forms. The furry and adorable-looking star cat might look innocent, but he assimilated the infamous devouring ability of the Unending One. Even if Blinky was unable to replicate the full might of the deceased Dark God's frightening ability to devour nearly anything, the companion spirit was still able to pose a serious threat against a younger and relatively less developed counterpart. The miniature giant was quite impressive for being able to make so many gains in his focus training. He had also matured a lot faster than he should. VS guessed that the Phase Lord department must have fed the miniature giant and other companion spirits with cultivation resources. If the Red Collective still supplied the rogue department with elixirs and such, the miniature giant definitely wouldn't have been as easy to disrupt. As it was, the enemy Phase Lord's companion spirit was ultimately wholly unprepared to fight against a companion spirit as remarkable as Blinky. At this time, the Star Cat dispelled his spiritual shield so that he could fully reverse the flow of the aperture that led into his imaginary universe. He wanted to see what would happen if he devoured the miniature giant in his entirety. Would the companion spirit remain intact when he found himself trapped inside a completely different universe that operated through completely different rules? Would the Unshakable King lose his connection to his companion spirit, and would he suffer grievous damage to his mind and spirit if that happened? There were so many questions swirling in VS' mind that he couldn't wait to complete this sequence. While the Unshakable King grew alarmed at what was happening to his companion spirit, what could he do? His amazing physical prowess and his specialized spatial abilities may be useful against corporeal opponents, but they pretty much posed no threat against a pure energy-based life form like Blinky. The miniature giant was supposed to be the Phase Lord's answer against more esoteric threats, but it was too bad that this companion spirit was at least several years too young to pose a credible threat against Blinky. After letting out a haunting wail, the companion spirit unraveled into a spiritual yarn before getting sucked right into the Blinkyverse. The miniature giant died before he could reach the other side. He was ultimately not strong or tough enough to stay in one piece before he passed through the other side. Nothing was left of him aside from the spiritual building blocks that used to make up his existence. The Blinkyverse was rapidly beginning to assimilate them by wiping out their original imprints so that they could integrate properly in their new universe. The loss of such a precious companion spirit had a very pronounced effect on the leader of the UR Titan Phalanx. He suffered a headache like nothing else. His composure broke and he completely lost his cool. Yet despite suffering such a serious spiritual injury, his resistance abruptly grew stronger as he held nothing back anymore. You deserve to die. Both of you deserve to die. No more games. No more words. Since your companion spirit saw fit to devour my own, I shall do the same to you. Progenitor or not, I shall feast on your flesh and gnaw on your bones. Your skull shall become my new wine cup. The Unshakable King's body swelled beneath his raiment, causing it to become much more strained than before. The furious Phase Lord moved with alacrity and struck with greater force. He no longer abided by the normal limits of his enhanced physique, but pushed himself to the utmost even if he was threatening to tear his own muscles. If that was not enough, he decided to supercharge his phase water organs. He did this by decisively burning the phase water that was embedded in his own lifeblood. His phase water concentration dropped by the second, undoing an escalating amount of his hard-earned progress. Yet, for the time being, he was able to strengthen his abilities far above their usual levels. The surrounding space almost completely fell into the sway of the Unshakable King. His control over it had reached a decisive level. The Dark Apostle was no longer able to pull off any effective external spatial techniques because he was unable to exert any control over the surrounding environment. The Unshakable King suddenly disappeared from view and abruptly appeared behind his foe with both hammers swinging down to dent the Dark Apostle's exposed rear. Defective or not, if those hammers struck the backpack module containing the power reactor, there was a large chance that it would malfunction, causing the plasma sphere to run out of power. Fortunately, the sudden turn of events did not cause the Dark Apostle to lose his complacency. He had seen his adversary pull off this trick once, and he had already prepared a response in case it happened again. He was actually thankful that the Unshakable King had made the predictable choice to approach right from the rear. It would have been trickier to fend off the traitorous Phase Lord from other angles. Just before those twin hammers could strike, the Azure Shield generator that had already been primed to respond briefly activated, while putting much of its power in the rear rather than the other directions. Since the hammers were made of a higher standard of transphasic alloys, the Azure Energy Shield only lasted for a short moment before bursting apart. The hasty activation had done it no favors, but the shield had thankfully lasted long enough to do its job. The Unshakable King had wasted a lot of energy and effort to launch this teleport strike, yet failed to do anything but disable a backup measure. The backpack reactor module remained intact, which came in really handy as it began to channel greater power into the Flame Lord raiment. Boosters helped the Dark Apostle spin around fast enough to be able to score the chest plate of the Unshakable King with the Tarragon Plasma Spear. The empowered Dharm burned and vaporized deeper across the thickest chest portion than the enemy Phase Lord expected. This was the power of a Dharm. Even a hastily designed and fabricated product was able to carve through the thick armor plating like a hot knife through butter. Though the weapon was enduring a lot of abuse due to operating at a higher level than it was rated for, the effects were more than satisfactory. While the Dark Apostle had launched a successful counterattack, he did not think it was wise to stay so close to his berserk foe. As the challenger attempted to create more space and back away, he found it difficult to move away due to the enemy's superior control over the surrounding space. It was as if an empty vacuum had turned into a confining tunnel network. It became a pain to maneuver through. If that was not enough, the Unshakable King utilized another means to ensure his opponent remained within the reach of his twin impact hammers. His raiment launched 4 tethered hooks that instantly found purchase on the Dark Apostle's raiment. Although the Flame Lord raiment was already beginning to burn the hooks and tethers, they were made out of extremely resistant materials. Only the plasma spear or another potent weapon could cut through them quickly. You shall not escape. The Unshakable King did not intend to give his adversary an opportunity to cut even a single tether. He closed in and swung at the red-clad Phase Lord with his hammers. This time the Dark Apostle was only able to partially fend off the incoming attacks. He was completely forced on the defensive as he relied on the shaft of his weapon to block as many hammer blows as possible. The fact that Blinky had quietly ensured that the concussive force mechanisms remained inactive only provided a small measure of consolation as the hammer blows kept dinging against the Flame Lord raiment. The red armor plating did not break, but they most definitely began to deform while also transmitting a lot of painful forces to the flesh underneath. The Dark Apostle gritted his teeth as he prioritized the defense of his helmet and his head. A powerful blow to his head could rattle his brain and leave him wide open. "VS, I need your help. I am already on it. Just hold out for a few more seconds." The Dark Apostle suffered multiple more hammer blows to his raiment, but finally the time had come. Armor purge. Several occurrences happened in a short sequence of time. First, an excess of fire energy channeled into the sections of armor that covered the sections of armor that had been hooked by the enemy. These armor sections abruptly exploded from the main armor and launched straight at the Unshakable King. Since the hammer-wielding Phase Lord was stuck in a full offensive posture, there was nothing he could do to prevent the glowing armor sections from smacking into his own raiment. At the moment of contact, they exploded, generating small but potent explosions that dented and damaged the thicker armor. While the damage did not seem trivial, it finally freed the Dark Apostle and interrupted the Unshakable King long enough to interrupt his routine. By the time the angry Phase Lord was ready to resume his offensive, the Dark Apostle had already approached him at an angle and thrust out with his plasma spear. The powerful Dharm almost burned a hole through the entire side of the raiment. The Dark Apostle flew back around and did his best to push through the hostile space to strike another powerful blow. This time the leader of the UR Titan Phalanx was ready. He teleported just a few giant steps forward, but that was enough to mess up the attack run and cause his raiment to suffer several painful hammer blows. Despite the pain, the Dark Apostle muscled through it and turned around to launch another attack run. However, none of them inflicted more than surface scarring on the enemy Phase Lord's raiment, as the Unshakable King relied on all of his remaining advantages to meet the incoming attacks and retaliate with his own hammer blows. The Dark Apostle saw little hope of making progress with this method and decided to back away for the time being. "Get back, you coward." The Dark Apostle was not in the mood to obey. "If I toss the plasma spear at him in his current state, will it end his life?" "No." VS answered through Blinky. "The integrity of his raiment remains high. The damage you've inflicted on it is fairly respectable, but they do not generate enough structural weaknesses to blow it all apart. The Unshakable King's raiment will absorb much of the explosive force released by the self-destructing plasma spear. That is an inescapable fact. However, I can guarantee you that there will be nothing left of it at the end. His physical body will also suffer light to moderate injuries. These are only surface wounds. His more crucial phase water organs remain well protected. If you decide on this course of action, you will have to finish the fight with the murder knife." "Fitting." The Dark Apostle formed an ironic smile. "It is only right that a knife named for the deed gets to be the first to claim the life of an ascended giant. That has to be a ritual of sorts, right? Our knife fighting skills are not as good as our spear handling." "I know, but what else can we do?" As long as the explosion wrenches those impact hammers away, I think I have a good chance of ending the fight. My Flame Lord raiment is still mostly intact. That should give us enough breathing room, hopefully. Fine. You are the one who is in control of our true body now, so you get to make the call. Just do not regret your choice. Exler. Chapter 71-78 The First Spear Throw. Chapter 71-78 The First Spear Throw. The duel did not go according to plan. That was okay. Neither VS nor the Dark Apostle harbored an obsession about following a plan to the letter. Anyone with enough experience in life would know that the future could never be completely calculated. Perhaps the polymath might disagree, but VS never assumed he could predict with 100% certainty how a sequence of events would play out over time. That did not mean that plans had no value, but people needed to be adaptable and ideally have contingency plans in place to account for accidents and the like. VS and the Dark Apostle entered the dueling ground knowing that the Unshakable King was the second strongest member of the Phase Lord Department. What he had demonstrated so far truly exemplified his combat power. Compared to conceited and close-minded alien Phase Lords that the Larkinsons had battled over the years, the overall qualities of this human Phase Lord was undoubtedly superior. His training and his use of tech and equipment already made him considerably stronger than the average Lesser Phase Lord. That made it difficult for the Dark Apostle to outfight the Unshakable King, especially now that the latter had suffered a soul injury that sent him over the edge. The Unshakable King was overdrafting his strength. His phase water concentration burned faster whenever he was actively clashing against the challenger. He seemingly had no other goal left in his mind aside from demolishing the man responsible for killing his companion's spirit. The logical response to such an unhinged display of aggression was to back off and let the Unshakable King tire himself out. The greater the delay, the more his lack of fulfillment put him in a depressed mood. However, the fight had already taken more minutes than it should have. A duel between Phase Lords could potentially last for days or even weeks depending on how timid they were and how big their bodies had become. The more mass at their disposal, the more hits they could take. While it was possible to kill a Phase Lord quickly by targeting his brain or his most essential phase water organs, the Unshakable King understood this truth extremely well. Even in his deranged state, his excellent fighting instincts and acumen still shone through. He defended his head and his torso against any attempt made by the Dark Apostle to target them directly. The Tarragon Plasma Spear had not been able to scorch the helmet once and only inflicted marginal damage to the torso armor. The Unshakable King's raiment had plenty of buffer left to expend. The Plasma Spear would have to repeatedly scorch the same sections of armor in order to create a breach. Then the Dark Apostle would have to slip in and target this single weak point which the Unshakable King would defend with great effort. It was much easier for him to block or redirect the Plasma Spear strikes when he knew what it was targeting. The only way to overcome this disadvantage was to create other armor breaches, but that would take precious minutes. The Unshakable King knew that time was on his side. As recklessly as he was fighting at the moment, he had never truly made any risky moves. Whether he did so with or without intention, he had turned his furious display of aggression into a brilliant defensive posture, making it far too dangerous for the Dark Apostle to mount his own offensive. This was why the Dark Apostle wanted to make use of the sacrificial spear throwing method sooner than they originally planned. They ended to break the situation and strip the Unshakable King of his signature thick raiment. Now that they had come to this point, the Dark Apostle assumed a static position relative to his adversary and began to grip his weapon in a very different manner. A mechanism hidden in the end of the spear shaft unfolded, exposing an integrated Audiobook-like construction that would enable the human Phase Lord to hurl his spear forward with greater force and leverage. There was nothing wrong with the classical way of throwing a spear, just like there was nothing wrong with building your own rocket if you were stuck on a planet and wanted to launch into space. VS at least tried to stick to the spirit of primitive warfare and kept it bare bones. He did not add any electromagnetic launching mechanism, nor did he add any aim assistance or target guidance functions. This meant that there was a larger than zero chance that the Dark Apostle could miss his crucial throw. In practice, this should not happen. The sacrificial spear throwing method was not a joke. It imparted a great amount of expertise to VS and his alter ego on how to throw spears to the point where they could probably join a sports competition and achieve good results. Perhaps their real experience may be lacking, but at this distance the probability of missing was minimal, especially now that the Unshakable King's control over the surrounding space had degraded. One of the downsides of losing his cool was that he was unable to maintain enough concentration to shake or solidify the surrounding space with his phase water organs. He was still able to cause momentary disruptions, but these effects ended far too soon to divert a spear thrown at this distance. As the Dark Apostle assumed the right stance, he utilized his own spatial abilities to anchor himself into position as much as possible. Unlike the Unshakable King, the Dark Apostle had yet to implant the lesser tarse organ, but that did not mean he was unable to pull off this particular trick. Just as Phase Lords were already capable of teleporting short distances without the use of specialized phase water organs, the Dark Apostle was able to anchor himself in a specific coordinate in space, though only relative to a nearby satellite such as Jotunheim. It was much more difficult to pull off this technique well outside of any nearby gravity wells. Though the Dark Apostle had to strain himself a lot more to keep his position fixed, it was more than worth it, as he could leverage the full power of his leg and back muscles into his throw. At the same time, he relied on his acquired skills in spear throwing to execute the correct throwing posture. He also used the more esoteric side of the method to pump the Tarragon plasma spear full of fire energy. They did not blindly mingle with the hyper materials, but they also activated the Dharm's ability to saturate itself with far more fire energy than was safe. As the fire continued to absorb more fire energy, it grew increasingly hotter and less stable. Heat and light wafted from the shaft as an excess of energy induced greater strain onto the structure of the weapon. Even if it was designed to contain all of this fire energy, it did not mean that it was able to maintain this state forever. Once the Dark Apostle chose to sacrifice the spear, he started an irreversible process that could only end with the weapon destroyed. There was no going back at this point. The minor demon that had been forcibly reshaped to serve as its artifact spirit also knew what was going on. It had previously cooperated perfectly with the Dark Apostle. It facilitated the offensive by powering up the plasma edge just before the moment of impact and lowering it when it was not being used to burn through anything. The demon also helped to regulate the flow of fire energy and prevented it from burning anything that was not supposed to endure so much heat and fire. Yet now that the minor demon knew that its vessel and likely itself would become sacrificed to fuel a powerful explosion, all thoughts of cooperation disappeared. He resisted with all his might. Spikes grew out of the spear as he sacrificed portions of his own strength to sting the hand that held the spear. The minor demon also tried to sabotage the priming process by creating malfunctions and redirecting fire energy elsewhere. Yet before he could go any further, Blinky appeared and brutally used one of the more forceful demonology techniques to suppress and immobilize the minor demon. You shall do nothing to ruin this moment. Know that in the short time of your second existence your life shall be used to fuel the redemption of hundreds of human phase lords. With that complication settled, the Dark Apostle was ready to execute the sacrificial spear throwing method in reality for the first time. His eyes and his other senses locked onto the unshakable king. There was no hiding the Dark Apostle's intention. In response to this imminent throwing attack, the unshakable king first decided to charge forward and whack the Dark Apostle into concussion before he could complete his throwing attack, but suddenly thought better of this foolish course of action. He stopped and hunkered down instead. He did not anchor himself in space, but he hunched his body and held his hammers across his chest in preparation to block the incoming spear as possible. A short moment of stasis passed. Both human phase lords appeared frozen as they faced each other in orbit of a frozen planet. Many observers held their breaths as they awaited the outcome of this critical move. They knew nothing of what was about to come, but most of them were smart enough to deduce that throwing a plasma spear that had performed so well up to this point was not a trivial move. This was especially the case when it was absolutely stuffed with far more fire energy than any hyper weapon had any right to contain. Just a few seconds passed in reality, but to those involved in the fight it felt as if an eternity had whizzed past their gazes. Then the moment passed and both ascended giants grew tense as they knew that the time of action had come. As the Dark Apostle stretched his body backwards just a bit further, he finally uttered the decisive words. The flames of hell have come to punish you of your sins. The Dark Apostle's armored body made an exaggerated bow-like motion as he hurled the Tarragon plasma spear forward with great force. The Audiobook construction enabled him to exert extra leverage into his throw, causing the volatile Dharm to soar towards the unshakable king with enough speed to ensure a hit. The plasma spear seemed to scream as it rapidly crossed the distance. This was not a scream that was audible to normal ears, as space did not carry any air that was capable of transmitting sound. The scream was of a more spiritual nature. What the people in the vicinity managed to hear was the death cry of a minor demon who knew he was racing directly towards his demise. This silent scream cut off almost as soon as it started, for the Tarragon plasma spear struck the unshakable King Hedon without any deviations. A massive explosion erupted instantly afterwards, causing the armored form of the Strategos and the immediate surroundings to become engulfed in an expanding fireblast. An excess of heat and force completely consumed the local area. Even the Dark Apostle, who made sure he was well outside the danger zone, had to back off a bit further in order to remain unaffected. The fireball continued to blaze well after the initial explosion had ended. The excess concentration of fire energy took its time to disperse. There was just so much of it that they continued to fuel the flames. The Dark Apostle and Blinky both watched on with astonishment at the magnitude of the explosion. That is more powerful than you described. My calculations were off. I failed to account for a number of variables. I think that the conversion into a Dharm is the biggest mutating factor. I simply had no way to determine how it would interact with the sacrificial spear throwing method. Now you know. Yes. Chapter 71-79 vs. The Field Engineer. Chapter 71-79 vs. The Field Engineer. The awe-inspiring explosion proved how well VS had spent his 35 ascension points. This was no mundane explosion or hyper-explosion. This was a sacrificial ritual that ended with a potent detonation. The fact that a minor demon had become part of this violent ritual made the explosions even stronger. A minor demon was actually not a big deal. VS could not have imagined how much more powerful the explosion could have been if he casted a middle demon into the Tarragon plasma sphere. As it was, the Dharm may have existed for a short amount of time, but it had fulfilled its purpose in an impressive fashion. As the lingering fireball finally began to shrink and disperse, everyone could finally observe the unshakable king's condition. He was in bad shape. His raiment had clearly taken the brunt of the sacrificial ritual. Its thick layers and its other protective measures had only held out for so long before it was almost entirely blown away. Only scorched and blackened pieces and fragments were left of what was once the thickest and arguably the most damage-resistant raiments used by Red humanity. All of the hard work put into combining the strengths and advantages of mech design, infantry armor design, and alien phase lord raiment design had met its end. The generous amount of phase water used to augment the protective properties of the mid- and high-grade materials had done their best to keep their wearer safe. They partially succeeded. It was pretty clear to see that by the time the initial blast had wiped out a lot of armor plating, especially at the front. Not much force was left to batter the flesh underneath. The unshakable king certainly did not enjoy a relaxing hour in a sauna. His front torso remained intact, but it had been cut and bruised to hell. A few of his ribs may have been broken as well. What was even more important was the burn damage. Phase lords were highly resistant against fire due to the enhancements brought by phase water. The phase water organs they chose to integrate also played a big role. The unshakable king definitely possessed a lesser Marigal organ just like VS and likely integrated other phase water organs that improved his physique. All of this enabled phase lords to resist attacks from mechs and even warships with their physical bodies alone. In fact, the unshakable king could have resisted incoming attacks a lot more effectively if they reached the full size of their true bodies. Being restricted to their current height did the leader of the UR Titan phalanx no favors. He remained small enough that the entire front side of his body became exposed to the blast as well as the lingering flames. Though phase lord bodies were resistant to flames, it was still possible for their transphasic flesh to succumb to them. This was especially the case when the flames were fueled and empowered by fire energy. The burns certainly looked bad on the surface. Entire portions of skin and flesh had become blackened into ash and coal. The less affected portions of the body also suffered varying degrees of burn damage. The wounds on the face looked especially ugly. As well protected as his head had been, the unshakable king's helmet had also been blasted apart by the explosion despite his attempts to shield his head with his hammers. While his weapons provided critical protection to the head, the sacrificial explosion hadn't been kind to them. The hammerheads had separated from their shafts, likely colliding into the helmet before getting flung away. Whatever the case, even if the helmet had done their job to shield the unshakable king from the worst of the explosions, it offered little protection to what came next. The lingering flames burned through the skin of his face, exposing blackened flesh, brown teeth, and eyeballs that still bore a strong look of hatred. Neither VS nor the Dark Apostle could explain why the eyes remained intact. Perhaps he activated an emergency device or a failsafe phase water organ that preserved his most essential body parts during a time of crisis. The burns had done far more than melt off half of his face. His torso and limbs lost that aesthetic masculine quality that made him look handsome and heroic. Now all that was left was a monster that resembled a burn victim. From the glaring eyes of his adversary, the Dark Apostle could easily tell that the explosion and subsequently burning had hurt his opponent but had hardly taken him out of the action. The phase water organs buried inside his body remained unaffected for the most part. They may have been bruised due to suffering a powerful concussive blow, but they should still remain in working condition. Several more seconds passed by in silence as everyone beheld the strategos defiantly clinging onto his life. Slowly but surely he began to move. He moved slowly but without acknowledging the huge amount of pain generated by his many injuries. Since he had lost his weapons, he was able to use his blackened and burned hands to remove the remnants of his raiment. They no longer offered complete protection aside from the rear, and even that had mostly become a hindrance due to losing all power and functionality. They had become a burden to him at this point. Even as he removed every single piece of artifice from his true body, he still glared straight at the Dark Apostle as if he only had murder in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak but could not convey any words. The loss of his raiment deprived him from transmitting his voice, and the loss of his companion's spirit deprived him from alternate means of communication. His eyes grew increasingly more erratic. They shook and became more frenetic. His body, which had truly appeared unshakable after the explosion, suddenly twitched and shook as if he was losing control over his own limbs. Blinky looked surprised. "What did you discover? Remember the minor demon? He has not entirely died. Most of him disappeared with the Tarragon plasma sphere, but enough residual negative energies managed to get out and jump into the unshakable king to contaminate his spirituality. The opportunity was too good to resist. After I devoured his companion's spirit, a temporary gap had formed. The remnant of the minor demon exploited this very obvious vulnerability and has seemingly merged with the Phase Lord. What does that mean for us? The Dark Apostle asked. I am unclear, but my guess is that the unshakable king will become more violent and unpredictable. He is easier to rile up, but his aggression will fuel his final stance. It will not be easy for us to finish him off, but the deed has to be done. Do not let him raise his arms and admit surrender. The time had come to finish this lengthy and difficult duel. The Dark Apostle had so far incurred little actual damage, but he reminded himself that this was just the first of 4 duels. He unsheathed his murder knife. As his second offensive dharm, the murder knife looked exactly like how one would expect it to appear with such a name. The power of darkness suffused the weapon. It had been stuffed with as many darkness hypers as VS could fit in such a slender blade. This gave it an ominous aura that dimmed the space around it and enhanced the lethality of the blade in ways that no one could explain. This was a knife designed to end lives, simple as that. It was a weapon of final resort that lacked the reach and heat of the Tarragon plasma spear. The dharm was not made for throwing. VS did not incorporate any of the adapted tech that could turn it into a powerful hand grenade. He instead utilized solutions that made it tougher and sharper so that it could do its sole job as best as possible. A knife was hardly the most ideal weapon to use in a duel between Phase Lords, but it was all the Dark Apostle had at his disposal. At least that was originally supposed to be the case. I added a last-minute surprise to the raiment. It is time to use it. Give me control over your true body for a moment. I need to do a bit of field engineering and I don't trust your clumsy hands. The Dark Apostle did not question VS' request and straightforwardly gave the original owner access to the true body. The human Phase Lord efficiently went to work. He immediately transmitted a special command that detached the reactor backpack module from his raiment. The reactor was fairly compact and had already expended much of its power to feed the hungry Tarragon plasma spear. Now that the weapon no longer existed, there was not much point to keeping the reactor. VS began to use his armored limbs to push and pull at different grooves and other seemingly innocent parts of the backpack module. Soon enough, the casing started to part from the construct. VS folded up the pieces of casing and linked the amalgamations together. He then retrieved a wrench and other basic tools scaled to his current physique from the sides and the internal cavity of the reactor module. He used these tools to cobble together a staff. By the time VS was almost done with his bizarre crafting session, he produced a complete metal staff with a round shaft and decent balance. It was not nearly as good as the shaft of a proper spear, but it was still impressive that VS had managed to anticipate this kind of situation and made preparations in advance. VS proceeded to place the handle of the murder knife into an open slot that just happened to match the exact dimensions of the weapon. A few actions later, the knife solidly became affixed to the shaft. VS had managed to produce a glaive. Though it literally consisted of a knife at the end of a pole, it had a lot in common with spears, so much so when VS withdrew his control, the Dark Apostle immediately felt at home while wielding the improvised polearm. He spun the shaft of his new polearm before pointing its dark blade directly at the unshakable king. Your reign ends here. I enjoyed this fight. For all of your ideas, you fought with honor and tenacity. I will respect and remember you for the rest of my long existence as the first ascended giant who perished at my hands. The Dark Apostle wasted no more time and went on the attack. He encountered much less spatial interference than before, as the unshakable king was no longer in a good physical and mental state. Despite his erratic tics and his absence of control, his fighting skills and instincts were still mostly intact. In fact, his partial demonic possession caused the strategos to fight with greater brutality and a complete disregard of how much abuse he was putting his body through. His pain stoked his rage, and his rage propelled him to strike at the Dark Apostle with his fists and legs. The difference in mobility was much less than before. The unshakable king may have suffered serious injuries, but the removal of his thick raiment made him a lot faster than before. He was even able to outmaneuver his opponent at times. A large amount of blackened fists and feet struck the Dark Apostle's raiment. This was despite the latter's effort to preserve his armor and avoid as many attacks as possible. The unshakable king was so fast, while the Dark Apostle's own raiment slowed him down. The flurry of attacks weren't negligible either. The unshakable king already displayed an abundance of physical strength when he was wielding his impact hammers. Even without his familiar weapons, his unarmed combat skills and raw physicality were still enough to pose a serious threat against the Dark Apostle. Chapter 7180 The End of a Dream. Chapter 7180 The End of a Dream. Everyone knew the final phase of the battle had begun. The unshakable king suffered a grievous injury that should have eliminated most other ascended giants if they had received the same attack. It was a testament to his formidable defenses that he survived and managed to retain enough combat effectiveness to still pose a credible threat to his opponent. The duel was not over. Whatever people may say about the strategos of the UR Titan phalanx, he attracted a lot of admiration from his men due to his resilience and his refusal to surrender to his pain and injuries. Even now, when his body was put in such a serious condition that his body must be generating a lot of agony, the unshakable king continued to demonstrate unrelenting aggression. Only murder was on his mind. He had to kill the man known as V.S. Larkinson at all costs if he wanted to have any hope of proving his godhood and lead the ascended giants in the right direction. The unshakable king still had plenty of phase water left to power his final stand. It did not matter that his phase water concentration was shrinking at a worrying rate. So long as his phase water concentration remained high enough to sustain his current scale, anything surpassing this threshold may as well be regarded as tribute to his dreams. The powerful strategos knew how to fight against spear users. He utilized his damaged but still relatively nimble body to move faster in space. He used his ability to anchor his body or just a body part to the fabric of space by creating footholds for his feet. This was a means to maneuver across the battlefield by sprinting across it with the help of invisible platforms. This granted him a surprising mobility advantage which he put to good use by circling around the Dark Apostle's armored form and performing lunging attacks at angles where the glaive could not easily reach in time. The unshakable king pummeled the Dark Zephyr with a flurry of punches and kicks before darting out of reach. These blows struck like jackhammers. The power of the attacks was not much, but they were still strong enough to stress and deform the metal plating. The Dark Apostle was not having an easy time at the moment. His lack of real combat experience left him flustered and unable to figure out a proper response. Though he managed to use his glaive to cut into the opposing phase lord's body a few times, the wounds were too shallow to hinder the unshakable king all that much. The Flame Lord Raiment released more heat and fire energy as it struggled to endure the accumulation of damage. Armor plating got deformed, parts started to break, and glitches occurred in other adjacent systems. Yet despite this unrelenting aggression, the Dark Apostle quickly got the hang of his new weapon and initially held it like a staff in order to block or redirect the incoming attacks. Once the Dark Zephyr finally managed to create a bit of distance, he finally chopped the glaive from top to bottom with the intention of cutting right through the unshakable king's skull. #@ and #@. The unshakable king finally uttered a wheezing cry of pain just after he made a last-minute dodge which spared his head from damage. Instead, the murder knife attached to the pole bit deep into the shoulders. Though the blade of the glaive failed to cut through the shoulder entirely, the wound still represented a serious blow. The Dark Apostle wrenched his glaive back and quickly attempted to distance himself from his opponent. He could have chosen to double down and launch a follow-up attack, but he was too afraid that the unshakable king was about to launch a powerful counterattack now that he was well within striking distance. As the Dark Apostle took stock of the situation, he saw that the murder knife-turned glaive had done its job. The wound to the shoulder looked ugly and serious. It may have damaged a number of muscle tendons, making it challenging to heal those injuries in a short amount of time unless he possessed phase water organs that promoted cellular regeneration. That may actually be possible, but there was another factor that made the wounds more serious than was apparent on the surface. The power of darkness festered in the wounds. The murder knife did not just cut flesh. Corrupted anything it touched. This was the entire purpose why VS had integrated as much high-grade darkness hypers into the weapon, to the point of making other concessions that reduced its performance in other aspects. VS knew that it needed to function as a finisher first and a tool to induce weaknesses second. The latter was important when fighting against enemies with plenty of fight left in them. The unshakable king made an admirable effort to power through this injury, but it was very clear that the punches launched from the arm attached to his injured shoulder simply weren't the same anymore. The Dark Apostle had a significantly easier time with coping against his opponent for this reason. It did not take long before he managed to cut deep into one of the legs. This significantly reduced the unshakable king's ability to move around in space like he was jumping on solid ground. More cuts followed that weakened his limbs further, but remained shallow enough that he was still able to maintain his aggression. The wounds did not discourage him at all, despite the very obvious fact that he was growing weaker. He uttered silent screams as he obsessively tried to beat the Dark Apostle to death. The Flame Lord Raiment did an admirable job of absorbing a lot of blows. Although the unshakable king was decent at unarmed combat, it was very clear that he was more comfortable with wielding weapons. His drive to win still remained strong, but his execution became increasingly more flawed. He gave his all. His life was on his line, but his self-control continued to dwindle with each passing second. To be honest, the unspeakable king no longer appeared as valiant and strong as before. After suffering a small soul injury and getting contaminated by the remnants of a minor demon, the powerful Phase Lord's cognition had gone downhill. He had become the epitome of the worst kind of Phase Lord, namely a madman who only knew how to solve his problems by pummeling them to pieces. Many members of the UR Titan phalanx had grown disappointed at their strategos. They had never solely admired his martial prowess. They also admired his intelligence, his leadership, and his ability to maintain his composure under the direst of circumstances. Where had all of that gone? Right now, the ascended giant had gone feral. He was no longer able to communicate with any measure of coherence. He had more in common with exobeasts than humans or aliens at this point. It was a shameful end to the short career of an ascended giant who used to be respected as the number 2 of the Phase Lord Department. Perhaps that was no point in killing the unshakable king. He no longer posed a threat anymore now that his mind had become completely scrambled. Yet, neither VS nor the Dark Apostle had any intention of showing mercy. Once they drew the murder knife, they were not going to rest until their blade had snuffed the life of their opponent. After sufficiently weakening the unshakable king without crippling him to the point where the duel should automatically come to an end, the Dark Apostle easily backed off and thought on how he should end this inaugural duel. The unshakable king is a traitor who has clung onto detestable ideas, but he is still a human who has done a good job of leading the UR Titan phalanx. VS softly said. If you want to take over the Phase Lord Department, then you must earn the respect and appreciation of the phalangites who make up the best of the best. You don't have to show mercy to your opponent, but you should not engage in pointless brutality. Make it quick. Don't ruin his body any further than necessary. Let the UR Titans retrieve the body of their fallen leader and send him off with respect. This will provide closure to them and allow you to command them without too many hard feelings. This is a leadership challenge. The Dark Apostle actually wanted to make his opponent suffer further, but there was little honor to be gained from torturing a crippled duelist. Everyone increasingly understood that this fight had already been decided. Any further delays would only annoy everyone who knew quite well that the Dark Apostle could have ended it sooner. He gripped his glaive with a stance that preceded a charge. Though the Dark Apostle thought about unmaking it so that he could land the killing blow up close, he clamped down on this idea. Even now the Dark Apostle still feared the unshakable king. The powerful enemy had produced a number of surprises. What if he had another one in reserve? No. This had to be done in the safest and most effective manner. After mentally preparing himself, the Dark Apostle stared straight at the rabid, but increasingly more tired eyes of the unshakable king. Your dream ends here. After your passing, I shall ensure that no ascended giant or other humans shall pick up your torch and turn your goals into reality. This is the price of defeat. My vision shall trump yours now and forever. Rest easy knowing that you have successfully strengthened my resolve. I shall do whatever it takes to lead the ascended giants to a better future, one where they can coexist peacefully with red humanity. No matter how strong we have become, we must always remind ourselves that we are not the only gods in town. With this final declaration, the Dark Apostle initiated a fateful charge. With his weakened and underpowered flame Lord raiment, he did not leave a handsome trail of fire behind. He instead charged with silent momentum, as if he did not need to pour any passion or aggression into this final attack. The Dark Apostle already treated this as an execution rather than a desperation move. Even if he was secretly poised to abort and back away if the unshakable king unexpectedly recovered, no such freak occurrences took place. When the distance had shrunk to spitting distance, the unshakable king raised his weakening arms as if that would help. Didn't. The blade of the murder knife neatly bypassed them and swung straight through the exposed neck of the unshakable king. It was a lot harder to cut through the neck than it sounded. So much thick transphasic flesh and bones were in the way that a normal strike would have stopped before cutting much deeper into the spine. Yet, because the Dark Zephyr had built up a fair amount of momentum during his charge, he was able to channel enough force for the corrupting blade to go all the way through, ultimately beheading the unshakable king. The head of the human phase lord tumbled away from the rest of his body with a look of disbelief. His limbs ceased to move at all while spurts of phase water-infused blood spurted from the corrupted wound. The power of darkness seemingly infected the blood as well, causing it to darkness and look more ominous even as they floated further into space. As for the Dark Apostle, he closed his eyes after he completed his charge. A sense of deep satisfaction sprung from the murder knife. Claiming such an impressive first kill through ritual combat had caused it to grow and evolve in an unusual fashion. Although it was just a single kill, the strength and status of the unshakable king were so significant that the murder knife reaped a lot of rewards from being used as the killing implement. If you want access to fast updates or the full novel in high-quality audio, contact me now and buy. I offer over 300 complete audiobooks from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, and more. No locked episodes, no subscriptions, just one-time payment via PayPal or Ko-fi. Message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out the full list of available novels on Discord. Start listening to your next favorite audiobook today.